In the present, the main character was merely an old man worn out by time, whose days passed in endless memories of a former life, of that distant existence in the civilized world of earthly inhabitants. When a young girl, who had wandered into his miserable hut, heard these mutterings, she considered the unfortunate man a madman immersed in delirious visions. Sadness gripped the child's heart. The little girl left him a treat prepared by her mother's hands, for which the decrepit wanderer poured out boundless gratitude. After that, the girl rushed away to her native hearth, secretly hoping that the old man's ailment would soon recede, and he would regain the strength to create and trade his crafts once again. By that time, half a century had already passed since the hero found himself in this alien world. Memories carried him back to that fateful day when he, along with colleagues from the workshop company, was making his way along mountain paths. Suddenly the elements struck them. A landslide swallowed the travelers. When consciousness returned to the unfortunate ones, they found themselves in a strange realm. Here dwelled gigantic three-tailed foxes and two-headed snakes of unimaginable sizes, and in the sky soared men, as if scorning earthly chains. Over time, the young man realized the bitter truth. They had landed in the world of xiangxia genre novels, which he once read during leisure hours. However, fate dealt cruelly and unevenly. His comrades began to live in prosperity surpassing anything they had known before, while So Eun-hyun himself received absolutely nothing. The wise entities descended from the heavenly heights and were amazed by the mystical talents of his companions. In the end, the immortal masters took the chosen ones with them to the celestial abodes. Only two remained on Earth, the main hero himself and Director Kim. Both cherished the hope that the heavens would grant them an incredible destiny as well. But the spark of divine gift never descended upon their souls. Possessing neither innate abilities nor knowledge of the laws of this world of martial arts, all the unfortunate could do was labor sweatily, earning their daily bread with their hands. But after 6 months of exhausting work, Director Kim gave up. No longer able to endure the hardships of physical exhaustion, he spent his accumulated coins on third-rate martial arts books that street vendors sold at outdoor stalls. What a surprise it was when, after 3 months of diligent practice, the director mastered the basics and transformed into a true master of fist-fighting art. Beginning to serve the state, he mastered increasingly complex combat techniques, until he rose to the rank of a powerful Jianghu warrior. And the hero was left alone, lagging behind everyone in this merciless race of fates. His soul longed for even the slightest sign from above, even a grain of special destiny. However, until the bitter end, nothing happened. 50 years flew by like a single moment of suffering, and here he was, just a withered old man, burning out under the onslaught of endless colds. The unfortunate man clung to life with all his might, but luck turned away from him forever. Over these decades, the wanderer learned the local dialect, mastered a craft, and earned his living by honest labor. He even managed to acquire a modest piece of land and build his own dwelling. He made a decent report on soap and alkali production. In this medieval celestial empire, such products were considered a relative novelty. But even this modest prosperity was snatched from his hands. The recipe was stolen, the production was appropriated, and the craftsman himself was mercilessly pushed out of the trade market. Now all that was left for the unfortunate man was to slowly fade away, awaiting the inevitable end. Rejected by the whole world, he shed bitter tears over the injustice of existence. The old man did not understand what he had done wrong, why the heavens had not chosen him. It would have been one thing if they simply had not chosen him. But to take away the fruits of hard labor, to take the last bit, this was impossible to accept. In the final moments of his fading existence, an epiphany pierced the dying man's consciousness. He needed to be at least a little stronger physically. Perhaps then fate would have given even a faint chance for a dignified life. With this thought, the decrepit old man closed his eyes for the last time. However, to his greatest astonishment, consciousness returned to him in the very next moment. When the youth, for it was indeed a youth, examined his own body, shock gripped his mind. He was wearing his former earthly clothes, the very ones he wore on the day of transmigration. His colleagues looked around in confusion, unable to comprehend where they had ended up, and the main character finally realized the dazzling truth. He had come to this world by no means devoid of special powers. His gift was simply regression, a return through the layers of lived years. Director Kim was clearly panicking. No wonder. They had just been following company business, and now they found themselves in an unknown meadow. It was the first day of their stay in a foreign world. The cause of it all was that very landslide, after which So Eun-hyun saw a bright flash of light. Of course, it was not easy to recall all the details from half a century ago, but he remembered the dazzling glow clearly. After it, the transfer to this realm occurred. The young man had no idea what to do next. In most regression stories, the main character uses knowledge from a past life to achieve success. But all So Eun-hyun had learned in 50 years was a soap-making recipe. While thoughts swirled in his head, he did not notice how insistently the department chief was calling him. Startled, the regressor turned around to understand the reason for the call. Suddenly, the department overseer lunged at the subordinate and slammed his fist with serious force right into the victim's face. He thought that the manager had surely fallen asleep at the wheel while they were crossing mountain passes and almost killed the whole group with his blunder. Honestly, for a brief moment, So Yoon-hyun even forgot how badly he had been treated in the past. He hadn't heard such accusations in a long time, and had managed to forget the true nature of this guy. This subject was a real madman. Even now he continued to threaten So Yoon-hyun with immediate dismissal upon returning home. The lucky bastard, the nephew of the company's managing director, became the department head at 32 solely due to nepotism. Colleagues tried to calm the raging overseer, explaining that the manager could in no way have foreseen the natural disaster. However, he still raged, shouting that So Eun-hyun was solely to blame for everything. And it must be admitted, there was some truth in the accusations. The hero did indeed briefly doze off at the wheel, intermittently falling into sleep on the way. And all because that idiot overseer kept overworking the subordinate, causing him simply not to get enough sleep. Moreover, initially it was the department head who was assigned to drive the car, but he shifted this responsibility onto a subordinate. While the upstart was running around and yelling, blaming So Eun-hyun for all the troubles, the young man himself was quietly restoring memories from 50 years ago. At that time, he was so shocked by what had happened that he was the first to rush to apologize, believing he had seriously blundered. He spent the next 50 years endlessly apologizing to people. Even when a gang of bandits pressed him against the wall and took his belongings. Even when martial arts masters mocked the helpless man. Even when an official stripped him to the bone under the pretext of customs duties, he kept apologizing and bowing his head. But over half a century he realized something. Humility is not weakness if a person is truly powerless to change anything. But now he could do it. Therefore, standing up straight, he made the department overseer understand. Now is not the time to throw accusations and sow discord. Shocked by the subordinate's audacity, he immediately went for his fists. The hero did not dodge, however he clearly understood. He did not intend to endure this for long. And in the next moment, the regressor attacked first, delivering a blow with all the accumulated rage straight to the boss's face. The hero was beaten by both martial arts masters and ordinary bandits while he was gathering healing herbs in the mountains. Every year the situation got worse. Crop failures, debts, officials demanding bribes. Unfortunately, they existed in a world soaked with violence to the very core. And in this world, the regressor gained what many lack, invaluable experience. For example, he knew that if you hit a person in the eyes, it greatly intensifies fear. When a victim is beaten in such a way, all they are capable of is only emitting screams of pain. And now the overseer finally shouted, beginning to apologize to the subordinate, and beg to stop the reprisal. Of course, So Eun-hyun might not have had the mystical talents admired by celestial beings, nor the incredible combat skills that would elevate him to the rank of an outstanding master. However, he had the strength to resist fate, the most necessary quality in his case. When the beating ended, Director Kim was amazed at how harshly the manager treated his supervisor. The hero clearly understood. He had lost his temper, so he apologized for shocking those gathered. He was also well aware of another thing. Most of these people would not see it until their own next death, so he still decided to apologize. After all, he was the one behind the wheel. The director, of course, forgave him. The department supervisor really pushed the subordinate to the limit. The hero could in no way influence the unleashed force, yet the manager went too far with the accusations. He had to apologize to his colleague for the injustice. The regressor had to agree. After all, they would surely meet again in the future with Director Kim. It is known that he will become one of the strongest warriors after beginning training in martial arts. If in this life the hero supports him, he will be able to derive considerable benefit from this relationship. Therefore, it was much wiser and more advantageous now to remain in good spirits with him. Returning to the beaten overseer of the department, he extended his hand to him and apologized for the unjustifiably harsh reaction. The first impulse of the beaten man was to become angry. It seemed he was about to lash out with his fists again. However, looking into the hero's eyes, his ardor noticeably diminished. Therefore, the upstart hastily turned away. At that time, when the conflict was resolved, the director suggested first to get out of the thicket and find a habitable place. In principle, if they found themselves lost in the earthly world, it would be quite a logical solution. Only no one yet knew that the logic in this kingdom was somewhat lame. The immortals rampaged, trying to strengthen their invulnerability. The only working rule here is the strong devour the weak. The local inhabitants of this world, Chinese with swords drawn, fought for a meager handful of glory and jingling coins. The Ascension Forest, the place where they ended up, held neither villages nor camps, nothing man-made at all. Therefore, since the luminary was setting, the hero suggested first to take care of shelter. It was a fairly reasonable thought on the part of the young man. However, the director was interested in where their car had gone. After all, it contained considerable supplies taken on the business trip. Unfortunately, it was unlikely that the car could be found. But hardly anyone would have believed the hero's words just like that. For this reason, he decided to allow those who wished to search for the missing item. To do this, he suggested splitting up. One group would organize a shelter, the other would go in search of the car. They agreed to meet again when it got dark. Soon night fell. Everyone gathered around the fire, many puzzled. How could it be that they were in the car when the landslide hit them, yet here they were without it? No one understood the reason for this. Therefore, they ate what they found in the forest. The hero, watching everyone satiate themselves with these beans, which tasted like chestnuts, asked no one to deny themselves food. He still had a sufficient supply of provisions. The director even smiled. Although they had gotten into such a predicament, thanks to the manager, the situation did not seem so bleak. After all, So Eun-hyun was truly a person one could rely on, a very diligent comrade. Moreover, as Director Kim understood, the hero was indeed very exhausted in the car from yesterday's overtime. The other comrades also stood up for the manager. After all, he always diligently fulfilled his duties. And besides, everything was turning out not so bad. They found a cave that evoked the atmosphere of a summer camp. In fact, in a past life they had to wander for a long time before stumbling upon this cave. Therefore, in order to get rid of any suspicions, the regressor simply explained that they were lucky. He was going to fully enjoy this universal calm. After all, this night was the last for them when they could smile so carefree. So the next morning the hero was already frozen in a bow, greeting the great mistress of the forest. She appeared as soon as she sensed a very strange smell. In all the millennia of her existence, she had never inhaled anything like it. Soon the other comrades also woke up, who were horrified upon seeing the gigantic spawn. However, the manager immediately shouted, demanding that everyone immediately bow and show due respect to the mistress of these lands. The three-tailed fox, quite displeased with the reaction of the other mortals, was convinced. All mortals are rude and ignorant. Usually she would have already torn off all their limbs for such insolence. However, considering that at least one of them understands how to properly deal with her, the beast decided to spare the people. However, they still had to pay for stepping on her land. If one of the mortals sacrifices a hand to her, she will allow them to stay here. The hero remembered the events of the past incarnation. Back then everyone panicked and shouted upon seeing the monster. As a result, they angered the fox and found themselves on the brink of death. This time, apparently, the beast liked the manners of the young man, so she decided to spare them and announce the price, to find out who is ready to sacrifice a hand. Honestly, it was a small sacrifice compared to all that they had to pay, especially considering that the severed limb would easily return thanks to the heavenly cultivators who would arrive in a couple of days. Plus, the hero had already prepared herbs to dull the pain, so he extended his trembling hand, offering it to the fox as payment. Of course, the beast, impressed by the manners of this mortal, decided not to refuse. It even promised to take the limb as painlessly as possible. Soon the severed hand with a crunch was in the mouth of the huge fox. The hero, barely holding back sobs from the pain, immediately reached for the herb that dulled the suffering. While he chewed the healing potion, the fox was amazed. The hero's hand tasted like typical human flesh. It seemed that since this mortal smelled different, it would taste somewhat different as well. However, all that was different were some strange impurities in the blood. The manager hurried to apologize to the forest guardian for the fact that his sacrifice was not refined enough. The fox kept its promise, allowing the people to stay on its land for 7 days. Moreover, it promised that the young man would not die from the wound thanks to its divine power that had flowed into him. Immediately after that, the three-tailed sovereign dashed away, rushing somewhere deep into the forest thicket. Only then did the concerned comrades rush to the manager to check his condition. However, he ordered them to return to the cave, promising to explain everything later. Already in the shelter, he told that he met this vixen when he left the cave early in the morning. He also said that they found themselves in a world of martial arts and cultivation. It was extremely hard to believe. Since So Eun-hyun sacrificed his hand, they were safe for a week. Later, they would have to give up something else besides the limb. Right now, the hero wanted to take a nap, so he apologized to his comrades for leaving them like this. When the regressor woke up, he heard some disputes in the group. The department overseer was persuading to sacrifice another part of the hero's body. He believed that everyone should support his plan. After all, no one would want to part with their hand after a week. However, the comrades thought that the hero was extremely useful. He provided shelter and food. Therefore, the overseer thought it would be better if the others simply learned everything from the manager during this week. The hero had already lost a hand and was not that valuable, so it would be wiser if he sacrificed himself once more. Of course, saying all this, the department supervisor expected that So Eun-hyun would not hear his speeches. Naturally, the regressor was disappointed. Because this time he was injured, the overseer now wanted him to pay with his limbs every week. He definitely was not going to forgive this. After all, it was already insolence on his part. Considering that the hero had 50 years of experience with violence due to constant beatings, he could easily take down an office upstart even with one hand. Therefore now, looking at this scoundrel, the regressor had only to decide whether to kill him or not. However, for now he lowered the raised stone, not wanting to act too harshly. He had already scared his comrades quite a bit. And if he starts killing, it could negatively affect the relationship with Director Kim. Moreover, as he was leaving, the hero heard the other colleagues silencing the department supervisor, realizing that he was categorically wrong. So the regressor was able to breathe calmly, rejoicing that at least the comrades turned out not to be so bad. Perhaps for the most part they behaved strangely in this situation, but still retained their humanity. Finally the next day arrived. The hero got enough sleep and somewhat recovered. Moreover, unlike the fox that devoured his hand, a two-headed snake appeared, demanding only a little blood as payment for passage. In a past incarnation, this two-headed serpent sucked dry all the blood of the overseer, who lost his limbs due to his greed. However, this time the colleague himself offered his blood to the fiend. But even this sacrifice did not please the scoundrel. The snake had never tasted anything worse in its long life. However, this was quite understandable. The blood of a 21st century office worker was soaked with nicotine and cholesterol. The taste of such a mixture was most likely disgusting. Finally, when the issue with the snake was resolved peacefully, the hero called the department supervisor to go with him to gather medicinal herbs and edible fruits. He, of course, was indignant that a subordinate dared to call him by his first name so familiarly. However, the regressor reminded him, they all want to eat, which means it is necessary to gather edible vegetation and fruits. Naturally, the overseer was indignant, but the hero convinced the upstart, promising to sacrifice his second hand to the fox next week if he died from blood loss. So someone must continue his work of survival in the forest thicket. The overseer expressed all possible gratitude for such a selfless sacrifice made by the manager. However, So Eun-hyun was only being sly. He knew perfectly well that the mistress of the forest would never return. So knowledge about gathering fruits would be useless to anyone here in the future. In the end, the regressor led the overseer deep into the forest and continued shouting instructions when he gathered the wrong plants that were required. He made it clear that from these berries, which the upstart was holding in his hands just now, one could even die a painful death. In the end, the young man took out his frustrations on the overseer in every possible way, just as he had done in the office until now. At some point, the unfortunate man became so exhausted that he begged for even a short break. He was terribly tired just digging in the roots of plants. However, the hero did not feel a drop of pity for him. After all, that was exactly how they treated him when So Eun-hyun had just joined the company. Therefore, he reminded them they needed to finish everything before dusk. They continued digging in the ground until they finally discovered ginseng. When the overseer saw the find, he could hardly believe that he had discovered such a rarity. The hero, however, perfectly understood the truth. Although this plant outwardly resembled ginseng, in reality, it was the root of yellow bamboo, ordinary in size with a pinky finger. But in this forest, everything was saturated with mystical energy, so the root had grown to such gigantic proportions. For cultivators, these roots were worth absolutely nothing. But for martial arts elixirs that enhance physical power, this was a real find that could help Director Kim cultivate inner strength. Moreover, 2 more bamboo shoots were growing here. Therefore, the hero asked the overseer to undress and put the roots into his t-shirt. Finally, evening began to fall, so it was time to return to the shelter. However, soon everyone heard the thunderous sound of a battle unfolding right in the middle of the forest. From the deafening noise, everyone fell to their knees except the hero and Director Kim himself, who stood on their feet, not understanding what had happened to the other comrades. At that very moment, men appeared, akin to deities. They were amazed. How many talents were in this forest? In the end, the celestial beings immediately began to argue to divide the spoils. Which talent would go to whom? The director was extremely agitated, not comprehending who these people were. In the end, among the 3 colleagues who were now writhing on the ground, the immortals sensed spiritual roots. The rest turned out to be mere mortals, devoid of the gift. The first of the celestial beings unleashed his lightning power, aiming at the department overseer. His body immediately sparkled with discharges. It became obvious. His flesh was the perfect vessel for the heavenly golden thunder. The time had come for the second immortal to find the person who would respond to his power. When he played on his musical instrument, the girl writhing on the ground screamed loudly in pain. The root of the transformation of the ghostly element is an extremely rare ability that seemed almost completely vanished from the world. The last of the immortals descended to one of his colleagues who possessed a unique holy body that even astonished the imagination of a celestial being. In the end, he decided to take all 3 as disciples of the sect of the creation of Azure Heavens, for within them lay a power capable of changing the entire cultivation world. The man, looking at the husband who was talking to him, felt such pressure from his inner power that it seemed he could pass away at that very moment. At that time, a cultivator wielding a pipe descended to this guy, offering to join the Black Ghostly Valley. For they had all the cultivation methods that disciples might need. Moreover, they possessed powers originating from the heavens themselves. Glory and riches that could be shared with their followers. In the end, all three Celestials began to argue over who exactly would take these three talents into their sect. Meanwhile, Director Kim was extremely panicked, hoping that these entities would help rescue them all from the forest. Otherwise, they were doomed to perish here. The indignant immortal only opened his magical vessel, lamenting that mortals turned out to be so weak. It was unknown how they even ended up here with their frail bodies. After that, the body of the department overseer began to be sucked inside the artifact. At that moment, the warrior of the Azure Heavens sect noticed the hero and realized one of them had voluntarily sacrificed a hand to the fox, the mistress of the forest. Although So Un-hyun appeared to be a mere mortal in his eyes, he was clearly not a coward. Therefore, the celestial being decided to restore his limb as a gesture of goodwill. After that, they dragged 3 colleagues with them, explaining to the remaining ones that they had already caught all the monsters and beasts in this forest along the way. So the next 10 years would be safe here for ordinary mortals. Then they flew away into the heavens, and Director Kim begged them to wait. After all, they had no idea where to go next. In the end, everything happened exactly as it did 50 years ago. No matter how much the survivors screamed, the deities ignored them as if they were insects unworthy of attention. However, it was comforting that the hero at least managed to get his hand back. Now it was necessary to somehow calm the director, who had no idea what they were supposed to do alone in this forest wilderness. However, suddenly So Un-hyun noticed a meteor shower. Bright lights in the sky, all heading in one direction, as if something important was there. Immediately after that, the next day, one of the remaining colleagues fell seriously ill and began coughing up blood. Another girl constantly sat with her friend, but did not know how to help her. She hoped that So Un-hyun knew some useful herbs or healing remedies. However, the hero asked to wait a little. They were useless here, but someone might appear who could heal her with true power. And indeed, they heard a voice echoing through the cave. The man was amazed that mortals had embarked on the path of ascension. After all, they were like ants caught between dragons in the midst of their quarrels. Of course, Director Kim panicked, as he did not understand who this man was. The young man stepped into the light and introduced himself as the king of the sea dragons. He had come here as soon as he sensed that something had appeared out of nowhere, and he had to find out the cause of this anomaly. However, he immediately noticed the girl lying on the ground and realized it was she who had unconsciously used storm magic. Of course, the dragon was tormented by curiosity. How could an ordinary woman with no hint of cultivation suddenly possess such a devastating power and do so completely unconsciously? So Heo Un-hyun hurried to join the conversation, explaining that they had arrived here very recently. But one by one, powerful beings like the sea dragon himself began to appear and take his companions away. However, immediately after these words, the young man burst out laughing loudly. He could not believe it. Among the hero's colleagues, there were several people with outstanding potential, and as if according to a script, powerful cultivators found them and took them away. It turned out, in that case, he was just another unexpected visitor who had come for the soul of this girl. Amused by the hero's stories, he decided to tell the mortal where they were now. This was a place known as the Ascension Path, or the Path to Ascension, the main gates leading to the upper realm. Very soon, somewhere nearby, a spatial rift called the Ascension Gates will open. This happens once every 1,000 years. Hundreds of thousands of cultivators and spiritual entities are already gathering at the Ascension Path to enter the upper realm, so it was not surprising that the Celestials appeared next to them one after another. Director Kim was still surprised. Why did those people take his colleagues into their sects? Even if the Celestials were heading to the upper realm, it was unlikely that his comrades, ordinary people, could enter there. In principle, the sea dragon was not surprised that it was difficult for a mortal to comprehend the laws occurring here. He explained, among cultivators, there is a technique that allows compressing large objects and then placing them inside magical artifacts. The Celestials create entire sects right inside such items. Their goal is to ascend to the upper realm together with their sects when the Ascension Gates open. The sea dragon also placed one of his underwater castles inside such an item. Inside slumber 1,800 sea dragons waiting for their time. After that, he approached the girl lying on the ground, realizing that she was extremely unusual. If she joined the Sea Dragon clan, she could become an outstanding entity whose name would resound in the upper realm. Of course, Director Kim immediately rushed to his colleague to prevent her from being taken. After all, she was already in a terrible state. However, suddenly he felt a force that pressed him to the ground, as if all his organs were turned inside out. The Sea Dragon explained to the director. He would give this girl his blood and accept her as his own. That would be better for everyone. Moreover, he decided to give people a small piece of advice. It is not worth mindlessly interrogating high-ranking cultivators. Of course, he decided to answer them, but only out of kindness. Others would have long ago killed them just for mortals daring to ask a question. Having taken his true dragon form, he flew away somewhere into the skies. In the end, by morning, almost everyone was taken away. Only 3 remained. Honestly, one of the colleagues was shocked by what had happened. First there was a landslide. Then immortals and dragons began to abduct her comrades one by one. All she hoped for was that the manager would at least not abandon them if he was also taken. In this forest, they definitely would not be able to survive alone. The hero felt pain watching this reaction. However, he understood. Her time had come. At that moment, the girl felt some pain inside, as if something was moving within her body. The next moment, she weakly warned her colleagues. Something was already here, very close. In the next moment, some old man appeared on an armored horse, who was extremely surprised that ordinary mortals had found themselves on the path to ascension. He realized, it seems that before the gates of ascension opened, all space became unstable, so they could have been carried by a spatial storm to this place. After that, dismounting from his steed, he decided to find out from the mortals who among them was emitting such powerful mental waves. He felt an extremely powerful presence, and even thought that this was a sage from the upper realm who had descended here. The director hurried to explain to the elder that this girl was their colleague. However, the old man only got angry at this man and immediately shouted so loudly that the man was blown away by the vocal wave. In the last moment, the regressor hurried to catch his comrade, preventing him from being badly injured. However, because the manager slid his back on the ground, it was all covered in bleeding wounds. The skin was rubbed down to the flesh. The elder himself at that moment decided to take the girl for himself. Although she had no spiritual roots, he could awaken them with his power. He was curious to find out what would happen if such an unusual mind evolved into the divine consciousness of a cultivator. The girl continued to sob, as she did not want to part with the director and the manager. But the elder was extremely disappointed that she still clung to earthly ties even after his warm reception. In the end, he lifted the 2 of them using telekinesis and began to strangle them. He decided to personally sever their bond by killing these people before her eyes. But the girl agreed to do anything if this elder spared her comrades. The condition of the celestial being was one. She must forget everything that connected her to the mortal world. As soon as she agreed, the elder immediately lowered the 2 unfortunate ones to the ground. He also realized, leaving these 2 here was fraught with consequences. Therefore, he decided to transfer them to the land of mortals, which was located nearby. He opened a spatial rift to throw them to a random place on Earth. Even the elder himself did not know where they would end up. They began to be sucked into the portal. The director just screamed in shock, and the hero did not forget to grab his herbs, which he had been collecting in this forest in the last moment. Soon these 2 were thrown onto some unknown market, where loud cries of merchants were heard from all sides. The hero came to and immediately rubbed his bruised head. It seemed he himself did not fully understand where he had ended up. In his past life, he had never been to such a place. So, that immortal was telling the truth. The relocation was completely random, although the road seemed vaguely familiar to him. Therefore, looking around, the hero realized, it seemed he had once lived in this place. This was the capital of the Yang City Sokyon. Very soon they got tired of wandering around the unknown city and sat down to rest. Then the director confessed to the manager that he did not understand at all what was happening now. Of course, it would be extremely nice if everything really turned out to be just a silly dream. Now only he and So Un-hyun remained, although the director was even glad that those fiends did not choose them as apprentices. The hero himself had not yet decided how he needed to act. Although he regressed, in the past incarnation he was no more than a herb gatherer. In the end, he realized, hanging around forever in back alleys is not the best option. Therefore, he suggested getting out of this dark corner. They walked through the city, hearing conversations around them in a language similar to Chinese. However, of course, the director was surprised that these people looked at them and whispered something. The hero hurried to explain. The locals were surprised by the clothes they were wearing. However, he asked the director not to worry about anything. He supposedly knew Chinese and could talk with these people. Of course, the director tried to show joy. However, honestly, he was frightened by the terrible sight of the hero's bleeding back, although the young man pretended as if nothing had happened. In fact, So Un-hyun lied. He did not know the Chinese language. Although the characters looked similar, the pronunciation of these languages was completely different. In his past life, he endured mockery and ridicule from the poor for 2 whole months because of his accent, just to learn the dialect. But now there was no need for that. For this reason, he immediately suggested to the director to go and find himself better clothes. Although the director did not understand how they would acquire them if their money was just paper in this world. Soon the hero came to the healer's shop to sell the herbs he had gathered in the forest. When the apothecary saw that very young bamboo, he almost choked. The hero was selling such a rare herb. The young man himself explained that this root of yellow bamboo was at least 8,000 years old. And, obviously, the elder decided to give the young man 15 silver ingots for it. The regressor was frankly amazed by this amount. After all, in his past life he never had so much money. However, he still pretended to be knowledgeable and demanded that the elder give him the promised sum as soon as possible. After that, they bought clothes and found a house where they could now live. Moreover, the hero promised, from this day on he would teach the director the local language, for which the director was very grateful. In fact, the hero tried his best to pretend that they had no problems. But after a couple of guards issued them identification tags, and after buying land and a house, they were left with only 1 silver ingot. While the hero carefully counted the remaining coins, the director just awkwardly stood aside. Moreover, he suddenly suggested to the regressor, now that they found themselves in a completely new world, to call each other simply by their names, and thanked the hero not as a manager but simply as a friend. Very soon, the director at home decided to find out from the hero how he managed to earn money for this dwelling. So Yu Eun-hyun explained that he sold the found grass. However, as soon as this vegetation runs out, the source of income will disappear. So it was necessary to come up with a new way to earn money. Of course, the director immediately suggested investing the remaining funds and starting his own business. The hero immediately estimated the approximate amount they could get from selling the grass. In principle, this money and the director's skills in managing an average Korean company should have been enough to stay afloat. But that was not enough. Since the hero had regressed, he wanted to dream big. Now he had a huge chance, considering that Director Kim was a true genius in martial arts. After reading some third-rate books, he was able to become a martial arts master in just a couple of months. As soon as he learned more advanced techniques, he became one of the most powerful warriors. Therefore, the hero considered it much more profitable to immediately invest in having the director study martial arts. Perhaps then the regressor would manage to accelerate the birth of the greatest swordsman by at least 30 years. Then he could benefit from working for this person. He explained to the director, this whole world was tied to martial arts. No one knows when local bandits might decide to come and seize their business. Therefore, it was necessary to strengthen their self-defense skills. Moreover, training in martial arts was extremely interesting, as it was only available to those who belonged to martial sects. It was clear. The man really fell for the hero's trick and behaved like a typical uninformed person. The regressor also told his comrade that several well-known sects operated here in this city. The Demon Slayer sect, the Temple of Self-Binding, the House of the Superior Bird, the Gate of Seven Secrets. All of these belonged to the Righteous faction. There was also the Wolf Fang Gang, the Dark Knight Association, and the Dragon's Battle Fortress, which belonged to the unorthodox forces. People were used to calling them the 4 Stars and the 3 Demons. All who were demon slayers mainly practiced swordsmanship techniques. The Temple of Self-Denial is a religious sect of Buddhism. The birds are similar to the Hao sect. They deal with information. And the Gate of Seven Secrets has an extremely long history, including various martial arts. On the other hand, there were the 3 demons, about whom much less was known. It was said their techniques were based on stealth and sorcery, and they engaged in suspicious activities. The hero decided to find out which sect the man liked. He immediately chose the Demon Slayers. After all, being a martial arts master is the most prestigious, and studying swordsmanship techniques suited the man perfectly. The regressor fully understood this choice. No wonder, considering that the man before him in his past life was called the best swordsman in the world. When it became curious where the hero had learned all this, he hastened to explain. He had overheard fragments of conversations around the district. Thus, 3 months of training passed before they set off to the combat clan. The hero introduced the director as his elder brother, who had heard about the famous demon assassin sect and was eager to master martial arts. Of course, the man immediately began to study the director attentively with his gaze. However, he understood. At his age, training would be extremely difficult. The director himself was amazed at that moment. After all, even from the outside, this sect looked as if they had plenty of money. The regressor offered the gatekeeper a silver coin so that they would arrange a meeting with the leadership. After all, even the simplest self-defense lessons would suit them. In the end, they managed to bribe the manager. He immediately realized that people had come to him who wished to study martial arts for self-defense. The hero provided 16 silver ingots as payment for the so-called elder brother to undergo training with them. In principle, looking at such payment, the man was not so opposed to taking in all who were external students. However, he warned, no leniency should be expected. Moreover, for such a fee, they were ready to accept only one of them. Even the hero was surprised that they were willing to offer so little for all the money earned from selling the yellow bamboo root. And the director could not stand it. He immediately wanted to get into a quarrel. However, the regressor agreed to accept these conditions and decided to leave his brother so that he would train here alone. In the end, the satisfied manager left and ordered that the director come to the yard a little later when all the external students gathered. The director himself did not understand what benefit there would be if only he studied martial arts, because if he had known it would cost so much, he would have chosen another sect. However, the young man assured the man there was nothing to worry about. The hero had never been strong in sports anyway. He only wanted to settle matters with the remaining money and support the director. Therefore, he asked him to try to focus on martial arts. Of course, deeply touched, the man promised that he would try his best. However, he was embarrassed that he was no longer a boy. He was not even sure if he would become a fighter. However, the hero was confident that his comrade would succeed. Therefore, he asked him not to be discouraged and to hurry to training. 7 months passed, and the time for the internal competitions of all Demon Slayers approached. However, the entire Demon Slayer sect awaited a huge shock. A man appeared so strong that he defeated their best students one after another. Obviously, to master martial arts skillfully, it is necessary to understand its true meaning and be physically suited for it. A third-rate warrior who understands the true meaning of martial arts can become second-rate if he finds his own interpretation. And to rise even higher requires twice as much understanding and, accordingly, twice as much time and effort. However, sometimes people with innate talent appear who simply skip all these understandings, bypassing all the stages in one leap. The Demon Assassin sect is full of such talented warriors. After all, it is the largest sect in the city. However, for a stranger to be able to defeat the direct disciples of the great sect, such a thing had never happened before. In just 7 months, Director Kim became a first-class warrior, mastering the technique of the Absolute Dragon Saber perfectly. Of course, the leader was horrified. After all, reaching first class in just half a year of studying martial arts, this level is achievable only through the combined efforts of many trained warriors. Not only was he a stranger, but it also seemed to others that all their traditions were trampled by this one person. Therefore, the leader had no choice and ordered to capture So Eun-hyun as well. The regressor perfectly understood. The fact that some stranger mastered skills worthy only of the sect elders in just 7 months threw them into confusion. In such an absurd situation, Director Kim was confined to his quarters on suspicion of being a spy for another sect. However, the hero did not understand why the suspicions also fell on him if he was not connected to martial arts at all. Moreover, the regressor was amazed. Director Kim was not worried at all. Even while imprisoned, in his room he continued to train. He did not even know that he should be concerned about the suspicion of espionage. And the hero reminded, usually in martial arts novels, in such cases, the given skills are destroyed or cut off from the energy flow. But for some reason, the director considered it a certain trial. If he overcame it, he would be able to break through to the next level. Honestly, these thoughts were like those of a true fiend. The man had only recently become a first-class warrior, and he was already talking about his next stage. As is known, beyond the first class was only the peak of martial arts, the level at which only the sect leader or elders resided. They were also called absolute masters, and there were barely 1,000 of them across the entire country. In martial arts, an even higher stage was not yet mentioned. Therefore, in the usual understanding, the peak of martial arts is the last stage that can be reached through martial arts. However, at such a pace, the birth of the greatest swordsman in this world accelerated not by 30, but by all 40 years. In the end, another 7 days passed in their confinement and constant training under Director Kim. Once again, he sat in his room meditating, radiating energy from his own body. His flow of chi was so powerful that such a thing was only available at the peak of martial arts. At this level, 3 flowers of energy manifested, and Director Kim himself realized he had already overcome the barrier. Now neither he nor the entire Demon Assassin sect was afraid. Of course, So Eun-hyun was deeply impressed. After all, the director's talent exceeded even his expectations. The man was no less impressed. He had no idea he had such a gift. Maybe that's why he loved martial arts novels so much as a child. At that moment, warriors came to them to read out the order of the sect leader. He gave the order to destroy the traitors and spies who tried to steal the techniques of the Demon Assassin sect. When the warriors surrounded the two, the hero began to explain that they were not spies and could not even think of anything like that. However, no one listened to the regressor. They immediately attacked him with fists. After all, they all heard how the two spoke in a coded language. But before anyone could harm the manager, the director immediately grabbed a sword and struck the manager's hand. He, of course, screamed in pain, then dropped his blade aimed at the hero. And the director calmly explained. This sect was the first one he joined to study the swordsmanship arts. Of course, the warrior immediately raised his hand to strike, not understanding how Director Kim dared to hit their manager. However, in the end, he did the same to them, inflicted wounds on their working hands so they could no longer hold a sword. In the end, everyone fled in fear, realizing that this devil had already reached the peak of martial arts. It was necessary to report what happened to the leader. Meanwhile, the room was in complete chaos. However, the director, despite everything, explained. He now intended to go to other sects for training. The hero decided to go with him, so he suggested choosing some unorthodox sect, for example, the Dragon Battle Fortress. In the end, they agreed to meet there, and the director went to talk with the leader of all demon assassins and the elders to somehow resolve the misunderstanding. Next time they met already on the high mountains. Standing on the cliff, the director kept waiting for the hero to arrive. while the latter was somehow climbing the mountain slope. Looking at the good-natured mockery of his comrade, the regressor explained. He had become too fast and strong. The hero could not keep up with him. However, looking at the fresh blood on his sword, he realized, apparently, the conversation with the leader and elders of the sect had not gone well. It was astonishing that this man was scolding him for violence. Even if he killed for survival, still, during the swordsmanship training, the director had changed. Moreover, the hero missed his former world extremely. It would be nice to return to an ordinary life on Earth. However, he still possessed the power of regression, so it would be good to go back before the accident and prevent it. But he could do nothing. Obviously, all he could do was survive in this world. After the betrayal of the Demon Killer sect, Director Kim joined the Dragon Battle Fortress and killed its leader, becoming the head. 2 years later, he traveled around the entire city, crushing various sects. And 3 years later, he tore down all the signs of the unorthodox faction. He became famous as the greatest warrior of the Celestial Empire and used this fame to unite the sects into a battle alliance. After 7 years, he and the director became like brothers and stopped paying attention even to the age difference. Also, the man created a martial arts technique that was perfect for the hero. The technique sword, cutting mountains. The man gave it that name, hoping the hero would inherit its meaning. The will capable of moving mountains. If he could master the sword-cutting mountains, he would easily reach the peak of martial arts. Moreover, the book contained not only the technique, but also the method of cultivating dragon veins. A first-class martial art, far beyond secondary and third-rate techniques. The only problem was that the hero's talents were truly disastrous. So after a few training sessions it became clear. The hero was a complete failure. In the end, even with the best master in the Celestial Empire, who developed martial arts specifically for him and personally trained him, after a whole year of practice he barely reached the 3rd class. However, the regressor tried not to be sad. At least his talents in medicine came in handy. In the end, years passed, and soon the hero witnessed something unreal. While the director meditated, exactly 5 spheres of energy hovered above his head, merging the 5 elements into one. That was the level about which legends were told. In the end, when the meditation ended, the director was reborn, as if he had become a completely different being. He even looked younger. Looking at himself, he realized he had undergone a complete transformation. However, he asked the hero not to be surprised by his appearance. So Hyun, of course, was amazed. After all, the director looked much younger than him, and he felt full of life, capable of anything. The regressor was sure people would go crazy when they saw his incredible transformation. Moreover, at that moment the director announced the time had come to hand over the alliance to a new leader. However, the alliance leader needed an advanced level of martial arts, but there was no one in the district who understood the true meaning of these very martial arts. Of course, So Eun-hyun had already reminded his brother. He was too special. It was unlikely that anywhere in the world there would be another genius like him. The director himself also realized this. At least among the people he had taken under his wing, there were no worthy ones. A total of 35 years had passed since the hero was again on the path of ascension. Now he was over 60, and of course he was extremely curious to find out where the director had disappeared to. A year after his transformation, he handed over the position of alliance leader to a new generation and retired. Of course, the hero wanted to leave with him, but to maintain order in the alliance, he had to stay in the position of strategist. The director said he wanted to wander through the world of martial arts and travel around the whole country. Perhaps because of this, he never appeared at his retirement ceremony. For this reason, the regressor even felt a little lonely. Of course, he bought a house using the money paid for years of service, but it was too big for him alone. However, unexpectedly, while he was wandering down the street, he saw the silhouette of a man, so he immediately rushed to him. It turned out to be a director slightly battered by life, who had finally returned home. He looked as if he had gotten into some trouble. Moreover, the regressor felt anger. The comrade did not even show up at his retirement ceremony. In the very next moment, the man himself collapsed to the ground to recover his spirit a little. He confessed to the hero that he considered himself blessed with a combat talent. And indeed, among ordinary mortals, no one had a gift like his. Of course, So Eun-hyun was amazed that the man equated himself with ordinary mortals. After all, everyone knew. Under this sky, he was the strongest. However, the young man fought with the cultivator. The hero had to remember, these were the very fiends who came and kidnapped their comrades. As is known, the celestial beings never revealed themselves openly, but secretly conducted affairs through the royal family, manipulating the entire country. After the founding of the Combat Alliance, due to their increased influence, the cultivators began to put sticks in the wheels in every possible way. The director did not like this, but resisting them was like going against an entire nation. Therefore, to protect the alliance, they had no choice but to submit. Because of this, the director resigned from his position. He decided to stand against the demigods alone and began searching for them across the entire country. These cultivators were extremely difficult to find directly. But even when he managed to and challenged them to a duel, they completely ignored his challenge. As they said, a mortal was not worth a penny of their attention. And then they ran away using flight or illusion techniques, not leaving him even a ghostly chance. However, 5 years ago, he finally managed to fight the cultivator and won. Of course, the hero realized. If the brother had done this while being the leader of the alliance, he would surely have had a lot of trouble. But the problem was that the director fought at the limit of his abilities against the cultivator, who had reached the stage of building the foundation, and could only scratch the tip of his finger. The celestial being declared, if a mortal even touches his body, he will consider it a victory. So yes, technically he prevailed. The regressor had heard about the stage of foundation building and immediately realized it was surely something great for the world of cultivators. Perhaps it was among the top 10 or something like that. However, it turned out that the stage of that husband was the second from the end in the world of cultivators. Simply put, he was a second-rate warrior of the heavens. Of course, for So Eun-hyun himself, this sounded like complete nonsense. He realized that cultivators are formidable beings, but Kim Yeon-hun's combat abilities were still colossal. He is one of those people who can literally walk on air and perform various tricks in the sky, break through steel tempered for 1,000 years, cutting buildings like tofu. And in the end, a genius of such a level was only enough to scratch the fingertip of a second-rate cultivator. Now Kim Yeon-hun understood. He hadn't seen beyond his own nose. They were nowhere near the level of the celestial beings. Each of the cultivators is as powerful as a natural disaster. Today he managed to cut off the wrist of one such cultivator. Obviously, So Eun-hyun was pleased. This meant that Kim Yeon-hun's martial arts surpassed his enemy. However, it turned out the celestial being simply wore a talisman, and his hand grew back as if nothing had happened. So it seems Kim Yeon-hun's path of martial feats will end today. He came to say goodbye to the hero. That cultivator declared that he highly values his determination. Therefore, he will take him into his sect of cultivators, and the swordsman will begin to rise again from the very bottom of the heavenly path. Of course, So Eun-hyun understood. Cultivation literally means that Kim Yeon-hun will embark on the path of immortals. However, as they knew, this is impossible without spiritual roots. It turns out the stage of 5 energies converging to the source, which martial arts masters reach, corresponds to the spiritual root of the 5 elements, with which cultivators are usually born. To master the talents granted to a celestial being from birth, ordinary people like them must study their entire lives. After that, Kim Yeon-hun cut through space and time using his blade. It was time for him to leave. Now he aspired to the next kingdom. He prepared a scripture as a gift for the hero, who decided to hand it to him one last time. Of course, So Eun-hyun accepted this scripture. However, until the very end, he kept calling his brother, begging him not to leave. Now in his hands was only the scripture about overcoming cultivation and exhausting martial arts, a teaching that would help surpass even cultivators. Of course, the hero was stunned, not understanding why the elder brother left, leaving his younger behind. In the end, time flowed on as usual. However, his fate repeated itself. Even though he lived 50 years differently in this world, he died again from a cold, just like last time. In the end, such was fate. No matter how much people resisted, fate was unavoidable. The betrayal of mortality caught him on the same day. To avoid feeling regrets again, he tried to live a fulfilling life. He was so busy that he didn't even think about marriage. But in return, he united all the martial sects of the kingdom and attained all the wealth and honors that one could experience in the human world. However, a feeling of disappointment still nested in his soul. Perhaps, with a little more effort, they could have reached the heavens together with Kim Yeon-hun. All that remained for him was to grit his teeth from a sense of helplessness and complete regret. Thus ended his second regression. In the end, he opened his eyes again and found himself in that very forest on the path of ascension. His body was once again overflowing with the energy of youth. Apparently, the regression was not a one-time event. The department overseer again tried to hit him for abandoning them all in such a trap. However, the hero instinctively dodged all his blows, pondering in his soul why he had regressed again. Now his body was filled with energy. This was another chance, which, without a doubt, was not so bad. However, he was sad to leave everything he had built over the last 50 years. The department overseer was huffing and fuming. The hero not only almost killed them all, but also had the audacity to dodge. The young man himself did not react to these shouts, realizing that regression was like a curse that deprived life of any value. Of course, the first regression was perceived as an opportunity. But what will happen if it continues endlessly? In the end, he will be trapped in the wheel of fortune, forced to tread the path of life and endure hardships until the end of time. Moreover, he will be unable to meet his acquaintances from his previous life again. The people now standing before him only had the same shell as those he knew in his past incarnation. Kim Yeon-hun, whom he took for his biological brother in this world, also does not yet exist as a personality. In the end, the hero, as if nothing had happened, asked the department overseer to calm down a bit. After all, his rage would not help them now. Moreover, he reminded, today the upstart was supposed to be behind the wheel. Also, So Eun-hyun immediately said before getting behind the wheel that he had slept poorly last night because of the ton of work that was dumped on him. Besides, he could not comprehend how he was supposed to foresee the landslide or avoid it. Therefore, it would be better if the overseer stopped looking for the guilty and thought about what to do next. After that, he addressed Director Kim, accidentally calling him by his usual name, Kim Yeon-hun, and promised to look for a place to stay until it got dark. He entrusted the others with searching for the car or a way out of this forest thicket. He warned, when the sun sets, he will light a fire, so everyone will gather around it. In fact, although he was giving orders to everyone, he did not know if there was any point in sticking with these people at all. After all, in the end, he would still be alone. As agreed, in the evening they all met in the cave and slept near the fire. However, the hero did not sleep, because the possibility of endless regressions was extremely frightening. It seemed to him, such a skill simply should not exist. Perhaps to get rid of it, he had to return to Earth. But judging by the fact that every time they ended up on the path of ascension, he had no idea how to get home. He remembered the words of that old cultivator who took one of the comrades to himself. He warned, before the opening of the ascension gates, the entire space becomes unstable. They were carried away by a spatial storm. This means that these ascension gates existed somewhere, and because of them, they ended up in this world. Perhaps, with their help, it was possible to return home. But first and foremost, the hero needed to become stronger. After all, being a mere mortal, he would not be able to change anything. He must become a cultivator, like Kim Yeon-hun. And as soon as he obtains eternal life, he will definitely be able to reach the ascension gates. In the end, the decision was made. He would definitely become a cultivator and pass through these gates. Time passed. He was climbing through the forest and searching for various roots. He decided to eat one of them and felt powerful energy splashing in his core. In his past life, he did not know heart techniques, so he ate yellow bamboo roots, but it gave him nothing. But if he had used the dragon vein method selected for him by Kim Yeon-hun, everything could have changed. Perhaps he could even break through the blocked chi pathways. In the end, he felt his heart beating extremely fast in his chest. Healing a body soaked with preservatives from fast food and stressful situations was not so simple. After that, the hero took it upon himself and made a homemade sword. This stick already looked more like something suitable for training. The regressor had always been a mediocre warrior. However, considering that he had hardly trained in recent years, his skills had rusted. Now he was young, so he wanted to make up for lost time by using the mountain-splitting sword technique. Fortunately, all memories were preserved in his mind, so it was only a matter of increasing strength. While the hero was training, the director noticed him and was amazed by his power. He couldn't believe that he had split a tree using a wooden stick. He demanded explanations. Of course, the regressor was momentarily surprised by the astonishment of the man who had taught him the cultivator's path in his past life. However, wishing to help him, he suggested trying the technique himself. But of course, once again a three-tailed fox appeared before them. The mistress of the forest was amazed that worldly humans were entertaining themselves here in front of the ruler of these lands. In the end, the only thing the hero could do now was to take herbs to ease the pain. He only wearily realized, both in his first life and in the second, he was a true weakling. Even in the third regression, his life was no different. He still went to the fox to greet her. In his second life, he swore to reach the stage of 5 energies converging to the source and become a cultivator. But even studying under the best master for decades, he barely managed to become a first-class warrior. His abilities were insignificant compared to the talents of the other comrades. However, in the third life, he became cold-blooded enough to tear off his own hand with his bare hands. After that, he offered his limb to the fox. He persevered. Even if his path would take millennia or 10 times more, he could not give up. The fox was pleasantly surprised that the mortal knew how to behave before her, and even offered a sacrifice of his own free will. In the end, she decided to accept it. The hero basically did not refuse to give his hand to this spawn until he surpassed her in strength. In the end, after eating his hand, the mistress allowed them to stay for a week. The regressor went into the forest and continued to hone his techniques. Apart from the day when the cultivators came to heal him and kidnap his comrades, he trained all the time without rest or food. He stopped only on the 4th day, when he decided to ask a question to the great king of the sea dragons. The celestial being liked the mortal's address, so he allowed him to ask a question. The hero understood perfectly. He wants to take their deputy manager with him. However, he was interested in why an immortal without spiritual roots was needed by the sea dragon. After all, she could not live more than 100 years as an ordinary person. The sea dragon was amazed by the knowledge about cultivators, and explained, "If the woman accepts his blood, she will awaken her spiritual roots according to her talents." The regressor was not afraid to ask the sea dragon to give them such a chance. After all, he and the girl are from the same edge of the earth. Perhaps they also have powers that could be useful to the sea dragon. However, he only laughed somewhat unkindly upon hearing this request. In the end, he decided to warn the hero about one important thing for his own good. In conversations with high-ranking cultivators like the dragon himself, it is necessary to avoid any requests. After all, they have lived for tens of thousands of years and have learned countless things that a person is almost incapable of comprehending. The sea dragon decided to forgive him out of kindness of heart. However, he warned, there are more eccentric cultivators ready to crush a mortal like a bug with just a sideways glance. After that, the dragon flew away under the confused gaze of the director, who did not know what to do best. After that, the hero spoke with another great cultivator. He explained that his colleague was a mere mortal without spiritual roots, so it was curious why he was taking her as a disciple. It turned out that this elder had a priceless pill that awakens spiritual roots. It can grant a mortal the ability to become a cultivator. Although to reach the spiritual roots of the 5 elements, mortals could also use martial arts. However, this path took too much time, and the result was mediocre, so there was a better way for people. After that, the elder, as usual, opened a portal, sending the little people away. The next time the hero opened his eyes, he found himself already hanging on a tree branch. He realized that he was in the southwestern part of Yango. In the end, his previous life passed exactly like the second one. In it, together with Kim Yeon-hun, they traveled across the country. Now, after 100 years of wandering, the hero knew every corner around. In the end, he helped the director to his feet and led him to the nearest town, explaining the situation along the way. Obviously, he was completely confused, but quickly came to terms with reality. Soon they reached the town. They sold herbs from the ascension path to buy a small house. The hero taught the man the language, as well as the saber that cleaves mountains, which he himself created during his second regression, modifying the sword that cleaves mountains to better suit the weapon he used. However, during the man's training, the regressor was extremely demotivated. In just 3 months of training, Kim Yeon-hun reached the level of 3 flowers in martial arts study. 2 lives were spent on training, and the hero barely broke through to the first level. In the end, having broken through to a new level, the director was glad that now he could finally beat even the manager. After these words, the hero was convinced. This person was not the Kim Yeon-hun, whom he once considered his brother in a past life. Moreover, mentally even this Kim Yeon-hun was now several times younger than him. After all, by mental standards, the hero was already older than this man's grandfather. Therefore, he decided not to waste this life following him. He explained that their paths diverged here and handed him a scripture on the contemplation of cultivation and the supremacy of martial arts. The director was overwhelmed with emotion when the main hero announced his unwillingness to continue the joint journey. The man sincerely believed he had made some mistake and was eager to find out the true reason for such an unexpected decision. The reason lay in the events of the warrior's first life. Kim Yeon-hun, who once led the Martial Arts Alliance, experienced the bitterness of despair after a crushing defeat by a cultivator. The second regression was almost no different from the previous one. He created a scripture on the contemplation of cultivation titled Supremacy of Martial Arts, supplementing it with a treatise, Overcoming Cultivation and Exhausting Martial Arts. He fought several cultivators but was unable to defeat them. In the end, the warrior capitulated, renouncing the path of martial arts and abandoning hope of matching cultivators. In this current life, the same fate awaited him, but the hero did not want to see his face distorted by despair. Therefore, he expressed to the man his desire to wander the lands, perfecting his martial skills. Moreover, the director's skills were already more than sufficient for independent achievements. The main hero taught him literacy, language, and combat techniques. Now the director is a warrior at the peak of his rank, and he has nothing to worry about. However, the man was still deeply troubled by another parting with his compatriot. To comfort him, the hero suggested meeting in this house every 2 years on this very day. After they agreed, So Eun-hyun left the director's residence. The hero's path lay through the pavilion of exalted reverence. At its gates, a guard stopped him, blocking the passage. Bowing in greeting, the warrior hastily explained that he had come with a request for a duel. However, the guard declared, no one can simply appear in their pavilion and make demands. In response, the hero instantly drew his blade and attacked the blade held by the guard. The sword shattered into pieces in an instant. The warrior realized that he had become significantly stronger, so he was surprised that he was still not taken seriously. After such a demonstration of strength, he was finally allowed inside. In the luxuriously furnished sect, a maid who came out to him escorted the guests to the place where the leader awaited. When they passed through the corridors, they found themselves in a huge training ground. The sect leader was extremely surprised to see the hero. After all, he had been informed of the arrival of a first-class warrior. However, he could not have imagined that So Eun-hyun would be so young. Bowing, the hero introduced himself to the man and greeted the pavilion leader according to established rules. After that, he asked the sect leader to share his wisdom in battle with such an inexperienced youth. He immediately took out his weapon, Bian, which was a metal whip. Deciding to start the duel immediately, he spun it, preparing to attack. However, the hero, shocking everyone present, blocked the strikes of 9 segments of the sect leader's nunchaku with one sword. The leader, watching the warrior increase his speed, realized he had surely already reached the level of complete fusion with the sword. He was indeed a first-class fighter, and quite experienced. He was sincerely amazed that he had met such a young man who was equal to him at such a young age. This meant that the hero was a genuine genius. The warrior only smiled, understanding that he could hardly consider this praise. He realized his level could impress, because others would need decades to master what he had already learned by 20. But in reality, he was one of the mediocrities found at every turn. The heavens had not endowed him with talent. However, despite the lack of gift, he still managed to develop his skills to such a level. 3 regressions made this possible. The hero decided that for now he would pretend to be one of the geniuses. He even warned his opponent that from now on he would use the sword's energy. Immediately after that, he moved into attack. Sword that cleaves mountains. The first form, overcoming the peaks. Then the following forms came one after another. He began to gradually press the sect leader. However, suddenly he became enraged. Around him appeared some overwhelming technique, through which it was difficult to break. But the hero found a way out, immediately rushed into attack, using the 7th form of the sword that tears mountains. In the end, he managed with his blade to touch the sect leader, leaving a small wound on his cheek. The disciples froze, not believing what they saw. The hero's sword became faster and faster with each second, as if cycling through the forms of the technique. Moreover, the warrior not only accelerated, but also gained an incredible amount of strength in each subsequent attack. When the hero used the 13th form, peak, emergence of 7 fires, crashing down on the leader with the maximum of his energy, and as if cleaving the heavens with this very attack. He cut through his seemingly impenetrable nunchaku, leaving only splinters from them. The defeated sect leader hastened to kneel on one knee to catch his breath. Moreover, he admitted that he had truly lost. The hero thanked the leader for the opportunity to fight. After that, he turned around and left as if nothing had happened. All those present, watching what was happening in the arena, followed him with their eyes. However, the warrior understood. No negative consequences awaited him. Pavilion of Exalted Reverence is an orthodox sect, widely known for strict adherence to a moral code. Now he had unorthodox sects next in line. Having traveled around the world, the hero intended to reach the peak of martial arts in this life. In the end, he visited 4 more medium-sized sects. Among them, he was defeated in 2, but won in 2 others. Now on the horizon was the last sect he planned to visit. He fought the strongest representative of the monastery. However, that one lost quite quickly. The head of the sect laughed. Now he understood what the strength of the young first-class warrior, who wandered in search of a worthy opponent, was. He admitted that he had carefully examined the hero's unusual skills, and thanked him for agreeing to this duel. The warrior wanted to leave. However, the old man stopped him, for now it was time to meet with a dozen senior fighters of the sect. The hero did not expect such an unpleasant surprise. Therefore, he explained that he expected the duel to end after this fight. He had never heard of subsequent duels, especially in the format 10 against 1. However, the old man only smiled after his words, implying that now the warrior knew what their customs were. The hero immediately realized they simply wanted to kill him. Therefore, he warned that he would tell other sects about their tricks, and then their reputation would seriously suffer. However, the leader was not worried at all. After all, during the duel the hero would definitely get some scratch, and then pass away. They will bury him with all honors. People will readily believe that an accident took his life. And, of course, no one will be able to refute their words. The hero's face will be that of a dead man by then. Looking at the little people gathered around him, the warrior realized they are not joking. They turned out to be even crazier than he could have imagined. But, however, the hero had always traveled for this reason, so he decided to accept this absurd trial. When the whole group of 10 attacked him, he realized this is a great opportunity to gain experience in real battles. Somewhere at the same time in the inn courtyard, visitors were discussing the young warrior who went to challenge another sect. However, everyone understood that this was a very sad end for such a talented guy. After all, no one in their right mind would ask for a duel with an unorthodox sect. But many also understood. When a man is young, he is possessed by naive thoughts like the world is arranged as he wishes. In the end, the hero foolishly brought death upon himself. After all, although this organization was called a sect, it was essentially a gang of mountain bandits. So after defeating him, they would simply bury him somewhere. But at that moment, heavy footsteps sounded in the courtyard. The waiter ran to meet the guest. However, he saw the hero, covered in blood, who asked for 1 bowl of noodles. And, of course, under the shocked gazes of the others, the servant immediately seated the martial arts master at the table. Despite a relatively normal appearance, apart from the blood, the hero was deeply enraged in his soul by the freaks, because of whom he almost parted with life. Not only were there 10 of them against one, but they also used poisoned blades. Thank heavens that the warrior was trained in the medical art by professionals during his work as a strategist of the Alliance. If he had not taken the healing pill and stimulant in advance, it would have been the end for him. And all the other mutts with bows and spears gathered in full battle formation, representing the last resort of that old leader. With them, the hero fought as if on the edge of life and death just to survive. And in the end, he managed to survive. After all, he survived this bloody massacre. He cut their tendons and left them crippled so that they would not even dare to track him down to take revenge. The warrior himself would not be able to relax for a long time due to an overdose of stimulants, so he could not expect sleep for the next couple of days. And of course, he decided not to waste time and challenge the next unorthodox sect. As a result, immediately after the meal, the young fighter ate a plate of noodles and continued on his way. This incredible feat instantly glorified his name and became a rumor that spread throughout the city. Soon people came up with a fitting nickname for this mad warrior. He was called Endlessly Warlike. In another battle, the hero realized that he was severely lacking talent. His goal, the peak of martial arts, was as far away as ever. Therefore he continued to fight, intertwining life and death into one, just to get closer to the goal even by a small fraction. In order to overcome all obstacles, he must become a madman. If there is no talent, then one must become reckless. This is the only way to catch up with a genius. In the end, the warrior traveled to many places in the country, engaging in several duels a day against orthodox and unorthodox sects. 5 years later, he reached the 14th form of the sword that cuts mountains, Heartbeat. But he had a goal like a mountain. Its core was comparable to the heavens. A sword like a silk touch is an art available only to those who have reached the peak of martial arts. Even its brief manifestation exerts enormous pressure on the mind. However, if the hero could not cope with this, then he could forget about catching up with the director. However, even this level was still not enough. But in the end, when Kim Yon-hun attacked, all the warrior's sword art was destroyed with one blow. At the same time, the approaching man admitted that because of rumors he had high expectations about the hero. They still have a long way to go. This time Kim Yon-hun won, retaining the status of the strongest man under heaven. The hero realized his brother really was gifted with incredible talent, so all he could do was congratulate him. The director became even stronger than last year. Moreover, over 5 years his body completely transformed, yet the warrior remained merely a first-class fighter all this time. So he understood the reason why the lack of talent drove people to despair. While he was thinking, the director decided to find out what had brought the man here. After all, they agreed to meet once every 2 years. But it turned out, after Kim and Hun reached the realm of the 5 energies ascending to the source, and also visited all the great sects in the country, he realized that he was the strongest person in the entire state. And indeed, no one can withstand more than one of his blows. Therefore he thought that he, the strongest warrior of the Celestial Empire, would do well to create his own sect or organization, and he wanted to offer So Eun-hyun a place in it. However, the hero refused, suggesting to leave everything as it is for now. In fact, the warrior refused, for he understood. If he accepted the offer, he would end this life just like the previous ones, working to exhaustion as a strategist or deputy. To reach the peak of martial arts, every second was precious to him. After the director said that it would be difficult for them to see each other if he focused on his organization, he began trying to convince the hero by enticing him with personal martial arts lessons. However, the warrior understood. Whatever he proposed, he would never agree. After all, he had enough mentorship from Kim Yong-hun in the previous regression. Now he needed real combat experience. Even in his past life, Kim and Hun told him, as soon as he reaches the late stage of the first class of warriors, he must strive to gain as much combat experience as possible. So in this life, the hero decided only to briefly testify about the adventures of his brother. After all, the most important thing now for the warrior is to continue his endless journey in search of battle. 20 years passed until they finally met again with Kim Yon-hun. And at that moment, looking at him, the hero realized his talent truly touched the heavens. The warrior was struck, for despite endless training, he still could not cultivate his mastery. The most important thing. He admitted that his understanding of sword energy was far beyond that of ordinary first-class fighters. But he still could not last longer than 3 strikes against supreme masters. And of course, the director found this quite strange. The hero was practically one with the sword. Therefore, considering all his accumulated combat experience, reaching the peak of martial arts should have been easy for him. However, the problem lay in talent, which the warrior not only lacked. It seemed he had even gone into the negative. After these words, suddenly blood poured from his nose. Now the hero was able to maintain sword energy only for half a day. Perhaps, if he could last a whole day, he would find a way to reach the peak. The elder brother wished him success and also gave him a book. Everything he was able to foresee during the battle with the cultivator at the core formation stage was recorded there. How to withstand his blows as long as possible. Moreover, he managed to escape safely. And of course, the warrior was surprised that one needed to know so much just to escape by fleeing from the cultivator at the stage of core formation. But the director was not surprised, considering that the cultivators were literally walking natural disasters. And to avoid the wrath of nature, obviously, deep knowledge is needed. The hero promised to preserve this teaching and pass it down through generations. Kim Yong-hun could no longer wait to find a new cultivator at the core formation stage. He prayed that he and his brother would meet again. But the director decided to give him one last hint: how to reach the peak of martial arts. You must constantly try to keep every fragment of information about the surrounding space in your mind. Just as a person does this during sparring or a real battle to later use that information, one must apply extended thinking not only during the fight, but all the time while awake. And honestly, the hero had not the slightest idea how to achieve this. After all, just maintaining the sword's energy gave him a splitting headache. And they were telling him about constantly simulating the surrounding space in his mind. It felt like his skull would crack. However, he also understood there must be a reason why the strongest master of the Celestial Empire gave him such a difficult task. As a result, from that day, the warrior began to maintain in his consciousness every fragment of observable information, memorizing the spatial arrangement of objects around. And since then, a full 5 years have passed as he practiced sword energy alongside this spatial memory. His head was spinning from the need to keep in it everything that came into view. It was a dizzying feat. Moreover, he learned to perceive not only visual but also accessible auditory information. However, the main character felt that in such an exhausted state it was simply impossible to get down to business. If we sum up the past 3 decades of wandering, the warrior traveled the entire country back and forth. From the smallest to the greatest, among countless sects there was not a single abode where the wanderer's foot had not stepped. Currently, the swordsman was simply exchanging one group of bandits for another, false righteous for real cutthroats, existing at the expense of the goods they had plundered. Suffering from constant dizziness, he had to fight against enemies using all sorts of cunning tricks in battles. Sometimes the main character had the thought that he could not last long at such a pace. Sooner or later his strength would finally run out. However, he himself had chosen this thorny path and was not going to regret the choice made. When the swordsman defeated another gang of robbers, their leader finally appeared. The chief warned the wanderer that today he was destined to breathe his last. Such a threat did not worry the warrior at all. He was ready to accept death. However, having been reborn again, he intended to continue following the chosen path. In the end, another 15 years passed before the main character met his elder brother again. Kim Yeon-hun also had not a single wrinkle on his body, and now exactly 45 years had passed since the beginning of regression. During this long time, So Eun-hyun reached all the stages that combined memory was capable of. Moreover, this applied not only to everything seen and heard, but also to taste, touch, and smell at an advanced level of perception. But that was all. The wanderer still had not reached the peak of martial arts. After so many incredible efforts and sacrifices, the elder brother shared the news that he had made a loud name among the cultivators. A substantial reward was set for his head. Unbelievable. The cultivators at the core formation stage ambushed him. Kim Yong-hun revealed that he barely survived that slaughter. However, he managed to scratch one of the pursuer's hand. So Eun-hyun understood for sure. At that moment, his older brother was also struck by an epiphany. But, unfortunately, nothing supernatural happened. It is simply impossible to defeat such a powerful cultivator. If the warrior had not fled, he would now be lying as a lifeless corpse on the roadside. Moreover, the younger brother did have some thoughts after all. For example, that these 5 energies, tracing back to the source, might be the limit of achievement for a martial arts master. Moreover, the swordsman suspected that the author of the sacred scripture on contemplation, cultivation, and the transcendence of martial arts had come to the same conclusion as he had himself. So no matter how much Kim Yeon-hun trained in martial arts, he could not overcome the cultivator. In these bitter words of the elder brother, the protagonist saw a reflection of himself, for the younger also tried to accomplish the impossible in every life. However, the difference lay in the fact that the wanderer's talent was rejected by the heavens themselves, while Kim Yeon-hun was generously gifted. In the end, the younger brother admitted that he was at a dead end regarding his inability to progress further. Even Kim Yeon-hun could not help. And despite the wanderer successfully mastering the technique and gaining the perception of a master at the peak level of martial arts, he never fully became one. In the end, the older brother suggested to the younger one to fight. He would express his opinion about his combat skills, since they had not had sparring matches for many years. In the end, the brothers crossed blades, and So Eun-hyun did not understand what, after all, was wrong with him. And Kim Yong-hun felt that, judging by the martial arts of his younger brother, he should have already reached the peak of mastery. Of course, the wanderer lacked talent. However, perhaps the reason lay in the fact that he needed a catalyst, that very adrenaline rush, an emotion that gave a person the strength to break beyond concentration. to overcome their own giftedness through struggle with circumstances. But at that moment, the younger brother's patience snapped. He went mad, not understanding what adrenaline was being talked about if he had been swinging a sword all his life, as was proper, all 50 years without a break. The wanderer did not understand what level of despair he had to reach, since he had fought endlessly all his life, trying to break out beyond a first-class master. And they told him that he lacked adrenaline. The warrior had already engaged all streams of his consciousness. Even in sleep he did not part with the sword, maintaining his energy. He even used that point at which he read and memorized all information again and again. But still, something was holding him back from the next level of development. However, very soon the main character calmed down. After all, he perfectly understood how he looked from the outside. A 70-year-old old man cursing the heavens and his fate. Having spent a whole life developing fencing skills, he had not come close to the next level of mastery. But at that very moment, Kim Yon-hun carefully outlined something on the tree trunk during their duel. The older brother created a combat technique capable of compensating for the younger's weaknesses. Perhaps this would not help the wanderer achieve his desire, but it would bring some consolation. It was a martial art called sword, mountain cleaving. Another 5 years passed, and since the regression, all 50, so Un-hyun clearly understood that he had very little time left to live. Looking somewhere into the boundless sky, the swordsman was curious about how his older brother was doing. The wanderer understood that they were very different. The younger's talent was exhausted here on earth, while the elder's gift ascended to the very heavens. In the end, no matter how much they, mortals, struggled, they could not escape the fate ordained by the heavens. However, at that moment, Director Kim appeared behind the traveler. Severely wounded Kim Yong-hun, without both hands, missing an eye. He was wearing clothes barely hanging on his body, so the younger brother immediately decided to run for medical instruments to provide aid. However, unexpectedly, the elder lifted him with some unknown force. After all, the warrior had no hands. Kim Yong-hun began carrying his younger brother away. Along the way, he indicated that they were being pursued by one person. The elder tore off the cultivator's hand at the core formation stage. Of course, now he was in a terrible state. However, he was glad that he had still managed to inflict serious damage on the powerful enemy. Kim Yong-hun felt a level above the 5 energies flowing to the source. Although all this time it was considered the limit accessible to a martial arts master. He demonstrated to his younger brother an energy sphere above his head, for which he risked his life, burning his life force to ashes. Of course, old man So Un-hyun saw that it was an advanced technique. The elder brother boasted that thanks to all his efforts, he managed to tear off the hand of the cultivator at the core formation stage. At that moment, a fragment of his energy entered the one built by the younger brother. As a result, the wanderer's house was destroyed in an instant. This demonstrated the result of all Kim Yon-hun's persistent training. Of course, So Un-hyun was stunned looking at his destroyed house. He had invested all the money collected over the years into it, being an endless warlike spirit. However, the elder brother did not notice the younger's despair. He was glad that he had come so far, and was able to demonstrate his power to the younger. Kim Yon-hun decided to bequeath his will to the wanderer. At that moment, something clicked inside the main character. He was filled with anger, but the warrior tried to calm down and continue watching the elder's combat performance. However, the wanderer was sad for the 3-story courtyard building, which would have been torn to shreds in a matter of moments. It was good that there were no servants inside, otherwise only mutilated corpses would have been left in their place. Moreover, from the blade traces that the swordsman saw on the surviving ruins, the younger brother realized that the sphere of advanced energy represented a concentration of the auras of 1,000 blades. It was truly incredible power, a technique stronger than any other he had seen in his long life. The elder brother explained that earlier he could only attack cultivators at the chi construction stage, and even then, only from ambush. But now the warrior could face them face to face. After that, Kim Yon-hun lost consciousness and coughed up blood. He fell to the ground, and of course the younger brother collapsed right after him. At the end, dying, the elder only asked for one thing, that the wanderer preserve his martial arts. After all, they were the work of his entire life. Kim Yon-hun wanted them to transcend generations. Of course, Seo Un-hyun promised to honor his will. However, he demanded that the elder brother stop babbling. His life was hanging by a thread. But at that moment, a cultivator appeared on the branch of a tall tree. The very man who came for Kim Yon-hun. After all, he was unlucky to choose an unsuitable place to escape. After that, the immortal demanded from the civilian, that is Seo Un-hyun, to step away from the criminal who had committed unspeakable atrocities against the cultivator. Of course, the younger brother immediately understood that this young man intended to punish the elder. The wanderer had no choice left, so hoisting his friend onto his shoulders, the warrior immediately rushed to run away with him. The cultivator understood how pointless their escape looked. But apparently Kim Yon-hun had told nothing to this old man about the power of cultivators. Therefore, the immortal decided to have some fun, and asked Seo Un-hyun to run as fast as a mortal could. But at that very moment, behind the fugitives, the cultivator created a whole army of skeletal undead, for which the main character was completely unprepared. Moreover, while the wanderer was running away, he was struck that the elder was nicknamed the ultimate martial spirit. Well, it's not a very unique nickname. In the end, now the ultimate martial spirit and the infinite martial spirit, it was the two of them together, were running away from zombies. Clearly a ridiculous turn of events. The only thing the younger brother asked was that Kim Yon-hoon not lose consciousness and at least talk to him somehow. At that moment, one of the zombies already stretched out its bony hands toward the wanderer to catch and throw him to the ground. However, the swordsman wielded his spear and in the end cut off the dead man's head, also killing the others who were too close. After that, the warrior started running again, indignant that he himself had to carry Kim Yon-hoon on his back because of age and not the other way around. After all, it was obvious that it was very hard for the old man to run with such a heavy load. In the end, the zombies pursued the two of them relentlessly. The wanderer could only run, biting his lips until they bled. A day passed, then a night, and the wanderer only guessed how many more times the sun would rise and set before they escaped the chase. Soon the fugitives found themselves on a huge cliff, very high and dangerous, and the zombies continued to relentlessly pursue them. The cultivator was, honestly, extremely surprised that an ordinary person held out against the dead for 3 whole days and 3 nights in a row. But it was clear, the warrior was already exhausted and could not run any further. After all, the ultimate martial spirit had long since been dead anyway. The younger brother, of course, knew this. After all, he did not call himself a healer for nothing. The cultivator was curious why the wanderer was running then, since the immortal only needed the ultimate martial spirit. An ordinary person was not interesting to him. The swordsman could have simply thrown off the corpse and escaped. However, the main character only laughed, astonishing the cultivator before him. The warrior recalled the sword that cuts mountains, Dragon Chi cultivation, the martial art of the Lord of Mountains, and the path of overcoming peaks. He was able to comprehend all this despite lacking talent. All this was thanks to his elder brother, his only fellow countryman and mentor. Therefore, if someone wanted to take the head of his teacher, then first the cultivator had to take the head of that person himself. Of course, the immortal was amazed that ordinary mortals had completely lost their fear of cultivators. Apparently this was because he had never encountered such madmen before, or because the wanderer simply was not afraid of death. In the end, the cultivator decided to show the audacious old man what immortals were capable of, inflicting pain more terrible than death itself. Tearing off So Eun-hyun's hands, the immortal attached them to Kim Young-hoon's body in place of his severed limbs. After that, the cultivator explained to his younger brother that he would make him pay for daring to treat them with such contempt. Using his dark power, he forced the ultimate martial spirit to kill its own disciple. Of course, So Eun-hyun was furious that the cultivator dared to so deeply desecrate the legacy of the deceased. However, from the smile of the youngest immortal, it was clear he absolutely did not care. The wanderer was lucky that Kim Yon-hoon was currently unable to use martial arts. The elder brother simply attacked with the brute force granted to him by the cultivator. And yet this strength and speed were at an incredible level. And with his frail old man's body, it was quite difficult to resist the power of Kim Yon-hoon. Moreover, the younger brother understood what incredible dishonor was inflicted upon the body of his mentor, who had already passed into the other world. But the warrior could do nothing about it. Therefore, he needed to finish this fight quickly. In the end, the wanderer activated the second form of the sword, Heavenly Lake. Once he decided to ask Kim Yon-hoon about his 21st form of the sword, Mountain Cleaving. After all his other techniques were named after some mountain, summit, peak, or valley. So the swordsman was curious why exactly the 21st form was named differently. He asked this question to the elder brother because he was the one who created it for him in a past life. So surely Kim Yon-hoon would know the answer. After thinking a little, the elder brother thought that perhaps this technique was somehow connected to a lake at the top of a mountain, or maybe it was named after some legendary lake from their world. In fact, Heavenly Lake is a lake that reflects the sky itself on its surface, and although it contains the reflection of the sky, this did not change its nature. The sky here symbolized training with the mountain cleaving sword, referring to the warriors with whom the younger brother fought duels, and the lake is a reference to his single strike. Heavenly Lake of the sword, cleaving mountains, for a moment absorbed all the energy flowing through the enemy's body. Thanks to this, it deprived the opponent of strength and sealed the energy in the swordsman's blade. This technique was given to him because the wanderer was a first-class healer, an expert in the field of the 8 meridians. Only the main hero could use this technique, as it was developed specifically for his fighting style. But if Kim Young-hoon's corpse remained intact, the cultivator would continue to exploit him as a zombie. That means the warrior must not leave a single piece of his older brother. The swordsman decided to use the energy controlling his legs and combine all the forms of the sword, cleaving mountains, into a single destructive attack. In the end, he began to attack using the first form, the second, and so on, up to the 20th. The Wanderer wanted to crush the teacher so that the cultivator would no longer dare to desecrate his dead body. The immortal himself, realizing he was losing, was enraged. In the end, he endowed the zombie with even greater strength and speed, turning him into a kind of monster. So Eun-hyun had to dodge his attacks with incredible effort. However, suddenly the warrior realized that his life would soon end anyway. He was 1 foot in the grave. Therefore, the Wanderer decided to use this moment to make sure that the teacher's body would not be further desecrated. He decided to burn it to ashes, for the swordsman could have died not a moment later, immediately after finishing his task. At this moment, everything around merged into one. The smell and sounds, temperature, humidity, and the texture of blood on the tip of the tongue. His brain was ready to explode, and so Eun-hyun did not resist it. Even if his mind roasted to a crispy crust, he had to finish his task, to consign the remains of his teacher to the fire. However, unexpectedly, although a moment ago the Wanderer's mind was ready to explode, instead of bursting from the pressure on the edge of life and death, the warrior seemed to overcome something. And at that moment the swordsman saw threads, as if showing the trajectory of the enemy's attacks. After which he realized, this was the vision of a master who had reached the peak of martial arts. In the end, the Wanderer wounded Kim Young-hoon. Using the last fragments of consciousness preserved in the zombie's body, the elder brother smiled. Then So Eun-hyun realized. They were different people. Talent blessed by the heavens, and talent rejected by the heavens. They were opposites, but at the same time similar, for they desperately fought to break beyond the bounds of the fate assigned to them. In the end, there was no genius or mediocrity. There were simply 2 people who opposed their fate throughout their lives. One of them was already dead, and so Eun-hyun was on the brink of death. However, the regressor perfectly understood. Neither of them would remain in this world. In the end, the cultivator completely lost. The main character fell off the cliff, rejoicing that no one else would be able to manipulate Kim Young-hoon's corpse as they pleased. The swordsman very much hoped that the teacher would rest in peace. Thus, the warrior reached the level he had endlessly awaited, and lived through this life full of endless struggle to the very end. His 4th regression. In the end, the Wanderer regressed once again, and recalled his life as a time when he continued to fight until his last breath. After that, the regressor shouted loudly and joyfully, for he had reached the peak of martial arts. He had gained the mastery he had awaited all his long life. The department head was extremely enraged by how the main character shouted, for it was his fault they ended up in this cursed basement. However, at that moment, the warrior saw a faint red thread stretching from the body of the department head. Now, even with his eyes closed, the Wanderer clearly saw where the opponent would strike in the next moment. Of course, the swordsman could previously dodge his attacks without looking, but only because he anticipated the trajectory of movement, which, in turn, was based on his colossal combat experience. But now everything was different. This was no longer anticipation, but genuine foresight. No matter how many first-class warriors gathered together, they would never defeat a fighter who had reached the peak. For he thoroughly foresees any attack with any trajectory from all who are weaker than him, leaving first-class masters not a single chance. Now the regressor acted based on instincts. The blue lines he saw around the head of the department chief indicated the opponent's vulnerabilities and the best direction of movement for victory. The red lines allowed reading the trajectories of enemy attacks, probably precisely because the difference in strength was too great. The Wanderer saw many weak points of the enemy. However, suddenly blood poured from his nose, after which the warrior's brain seemed to start burning from the inside. Apparently, this vision was overloading his mind. Using this moment of confusion, the department chief attacked the main hero again. However, he instinctively jumped back, and to avoid hearing further his screams about how this regressor had doomed them, the swordsman boldly dodged the blows. So Yi Eun-hyun stunned him shortly after. Soon the whole crowd of colleagues gathered near them, and the Wanderer was extremely disappointed that after such a short use of the master's gaze, his head hurt so unbearably. In the end, he calmed his colleagues, led them to the cave by the fire, and then prepared a couple of fruits. Sending his comrades to rest, the warrior himself resumed training. The regressor could already cut a leaf without applying any energy, using the most ordinary branch for this. Moreover, as he understood, the vision of a warrior at the peak of martial arts predicted every movement of the opponent, and the brain was already coloring the lines during the information processing. With this skill, the Wanderer could read any step of the opponent and strike directly at the weak spot in the most optimal way. That is why Kim Young-hoon ordered to hone all 5 senses. It was a kind of projection of the vision of a master at the peak of martial arts. The elder brother specifically enhanced his senses so that the swordsman would develop a semblance of foresight of the opponent's strike trajectories. And honestly, this ability was truly incredible. In the end, the regressor, looking at the falling leaves, imagined that all these leaves were a huge number of enemies. With a skillful movement, he cut them all down, visualizing how he won this battle. And only at dawn did the warrior realize that he had now fully comprehended the peak of martial arts. However, the feeling that his brain was about to explode still did not leave the Wanderer. Now, After he dug up 8 roots of yellow bamboo nearby and applied the method of dragon veins, the regressor gained the ability to maintain peak vision for a full 3 hours. With such a level of skill, there was no longer a need to trade yellow bamboo roots to solve financial issues. His fencing skills alone would suffice. After that, the main character returned to the cave where the director was resting. Now the warrior's mind was filled with all the discoveries of Kim Yeon-hun, not to mention the last teaching that he shared before his death. If all this knowledge is fully passed on to the elder brother, he will surely surpass his former self in this life. And the regressor, having reached the peak of martial arts, will receive from him a new teaching that will allow him to surpass everything he learned in previous regressions. Of course, the wanderer had no idea yet how to reach the next level. But unlike his colleagues, he had no choice but endless training. Moreover, the swordsman had to constantly endure unprecedented pressure on his brain while adapting to the new vision. In the end, his primary goal in this life was to deal with the consuming darkness, and the warrior also wanted to reach the level where 3 flowers gather at the summit. He wanted to understand what was considered the pinnacle of the peak in the world of martial arts, and was called the very 3 flowers. Morning came. The fox, who was considered the lord of the forest, came this time for their souls. While the regressor once again offered him his hand as a sacrifice, his curiosity did not subside. Would this monster also see the red lines? However, what was astonishing was that the wanderer saw absolutely everything in red. Therefore, at the moment when the fox bit off his hand, the warrior realized that there was no way to defeat this creature. However, the main character was extremely curious about how it could be that red was everywhere within his field of vision. A few days later, when cultivators appeared at the foundation building stage, they also glowed entirely red. So the regressor understood the difference between cultivators and ordinary warriors. They simply could not be defeated. After all, they did not have a single breach. Even a spearmaster would find it incredibly difficult to deal with the weakest cultivators, those with 1 star at the foundation perfection stage. Sometime after the cultivators took his colleagues, the wanderer again addressed the sea dragon with a question, bowing according to all the rules. The warrior explained that such a miserable mortal dared to ask a question to the great master. In the end, he described what he had seen and asked about the red sphere that surrounded the cultivators. The sea dragon explained that cultivators possessed a special form of consciousness, the so-called divine consciousness. The consciousness of an ordinary mortal did not extend beyond his brain, but cultivators could expand theirs to encompass part of the surrounding space. Since the sea dragon was also a spiritual entity, he was capable of this. After satisfying the curiosity of the ordinary mortal, he left. Since the dialogue took place in the language of this world, obviously, the people around him did not understand a word. Sometime after the dragon left, a hunchbacked old man with a cane appeared to take the manager away. In the end, he threw the regressor and the director into a spatial rift. This time, when they came to, the 2 of them found themselves in some kind of water. The swordsman helped the director get out, while he himself was indignant that last time he was thrown onto the top of a tree and this time into a body of water. The director soon also regained consciousness and tried to understand where they were. However, the warrior explained that this was a completely different world than the one he knew, and considering the landscape, they were on a round lake near which a city was supposed to be located. Of course, Kim Yeon-hun panicked, not understanding what they should do. After all, if there were people around here, they could ask them for directions. However, the regressor pretended to guess. On the other side of the lake there were some structures, and he suggested going there. Since the wanderer could swim, he decided to go there first and get some food for them. In fact, if the main character's memory did not fail him, there was a bandit's lair. In his previous life, he had actually ended up there. Their leader was at a late stage of a first-class warrior, and his deputy was at a middle stage. The rest were second-rate and third-rate bandits. Of course, they had a numerical advantage, and the warrior had to apply poison to his sword to deal with them. At that time, the bandits were calmly engaged in their usual activities in the lair. However, suddenly they saw some man in the water. Therefore, they immediately advised him to get lost if he valued his life, since he clearly did not realize where he had swum. When the wanderer did not retreat and had already come ashore, one immediately attacked him with a stick, warning that he was to blame for not leaving as quickly as possible. However, the regressor, wielding only 1 fist, struck the man with such a crushing force that he immediately fell to the ground. After that, the warrior took his stick, which was strong enough to deal with all these scoundrels. Approaching closer, the swordsman decided to find out how many people they had already managed to kill during their banditry. A strong fighter immediately stepped forward to him, warning that during his career alone, he had beaten 50 people to death. However, the stranger knocked his head off with just 1 stick. He ordered that only those who had taken at least 1 life should attack him. At the same time, the leader was having fun with his friends, mocking the women who served them. These were captives, treated like animals, ordered around as they pleased, their will subdued. They had no right to choose. However, suddenly the regressor burst in on them, carrying one of the severed heads in his hands. The leader quickly realized that one of their enemies had shown up, so he immediately ordered his guys to take up arms. The warrior, at that moment, stopped and understood that even asking whether these people had killed was pointless. They would all be dead soon. Soon the leader was lying on the ground, realizing that a master of peak level had come to them. He begged for mercy. However, the wanderer asked how long he had already been there, and it turned out that no more than a quarter of an hour had passed since his arrival. In his past life, So Eun-hyun took a whole day to kill all these bandits. He set the place on fire, retreated, and ambushed each of them with a poisoned blade. Now it took him only 15 minutes. Moreover, the regressor killed them all with an ordinary stick. In the end, having learned everything necessary, the swordsman decided to finish off the leader. However, the latter promised to tell the stranger where all the money was hidden. However, So Eun-hyun himself already knew where they were from his past life, so he killed the man without remorse. After that, the warrior also freed all the slaves they had kidnapped during their raids. And, of course, everyone was insanely grateful to the main hero for giving those cursed bandits what they deserved. They begged their savior to say his name so they could thank him. The regressor could not think of anything better than to recall the name Infinite Warring Spirit, as he was called in his past life. After that, together with the director, they went to the capital. The wanderers made ancestral tablets, acquired an estate with money obtained from bandits. After that, the swordsman, as in the past life, began to teach Kim Yeon-hoon literacy and martial arts. 2 months later, the director had already reached the peak level of 3 flowers. This time he became even faster, which made the regressor feel a little oppressed. However, it was always like this. Some have to spend a whole life to reach the peak, while others, thanks to the teachings of the peak master, skip the peak stage and immediately reach 3 flowers gathered at the summit. In the end, the warrior congratulated the director, and yet he had not properly learned to read and write, but had already mastered very high-level martial arts. Kim Yeon-hoon himself was surprised that such an incredible fighting talent was hidden within him. At that moment, the wanderer remembered that since Kim Yeon-hoon had reached this level, he had never properly sparred with him further. It was Kim Yeon-hoon who taught him. The regressor did not know what to do next. He had already reached the peak of martial arts, but Kim Yeon-hoon had surpassed him by gathering 3 flowers. In the end, the swordsman dared to propose a duel, and Kim Yeon-hoon did not resist, because he believed that this time he could defeat the main character. After that, the two clashed in a duel in a remote wilderness so as not to harm anyone with their powers. Kim Yeon-hoon lunged at the wanderer, using the impulse blade, devastating the dragon's tomb. He spun so much that all the regressor's lines got tangled in an instant. Therefore, the best choice was simply to dodge. However, if the warrior continued to dodge again, then Kim Yeon-hoon would continue to push him back. For some reason, the desire to win burned so fiercely within him. He himself did not understand where it came from. Or perhaps the swordsman simply intuitively realized that this was the last chance to defeat him in this regression. Next, the older brother would continue to grow at a terrifying speed. Next time he would be so incomprehensibly far ahead that the wanderer would not even be able to look him in the eye. At that very moment, while he had only reached 3 flowers, the regressor had the last chance to defeat him. He absolutely had to win, even if he had to risk everything. In the end, the wanderer used a throwing weapon, thereby slightly confusing Kim Yeon-hoon. After that, the warrior prepared to attack, realizing his advantage in practical combat experience. He was far ahead of the director. When the regressor attacked the man with terrifying force, he was a little stunned and stepped back. However, very soon Kim Yeon-hoon smiled again and decided to show his teacher the power of the 3 flowers. At that very moment, all the feelings of the main character began to scream about danger, as if something serious was approaching. The man attacked, and the swordsman perfectly understood. If he accepted this blow, he would simply be cut in half. However, the technique of the sword that cuts mountains, which he practiced, was an incomparable martial art created by the genius Kim Yeon-hoon when he reached the level of 5 energies emanating from the source. Therefore, the wanderer was confident. He could suppress this power of the 3 flowers with the sword that cuts mountains and plains. However, it was astonishing that even after the counterattack, Kim Yeon-hoon managed to stand firm. Obviously, after that, his blade should have broken, and Kim Yeon-hoon himself should have been thrown far back. In the end, the elder brother's weapon really broke. This was a disgrace for any swordsman, so he was deeply impressed by how experienced and skillful So Eun-hyun turned out to be as a warrior. However, the regressor hastened to calm the director, for from now on he would hardly be able to defeat him. After this duel, there was no way he could surpass Kim Yeon-hoon until the next life. Moreover, considering that the director had already reached the level of the 3 flowers gathered at the summit, the wanderer prepared a gift for him. Of course, the man thought that the duel itself was already a gift. However, the warrior brought him stacks of books. These were Talmuds on martial arts, scriptures on overcoming cultivation and exhausting martial arts, which he took from an old man. He assured the main character that studying these books required a level of 3 flowers. Of course, So Eun-hyun lied that he tried to read these books but understood nothing. Therefore, he decided to give them to Kim Young-hoon. In the end, having completed all the literacy lessons, he took up studying the scripture of overcoming cultivation and exhausting martial arts, greedily absorbing knowledge. 4 months passed, and the regressor came to bring money. This time the catch was not bad, so he was paid well. However, when the wanderer entered, there was no trace of Kim Young-hoon's presence in the room. So the warrior assumed that the older brother had gone somewhere. But suddenly he appeared from some spatial rift, grinning slyly. Very soon the older brother explained that he decided to try one technique from this scripture, and the regressor really could not detect him. That means the book contained truly unparalleled martial arts. So Eun-hyun himself realized this was probably the very strange technique that Kim Young-hoon used in his past life. However, back then he studied it upon reaching 5 energies flowing to the source. But in this life, only a little time had passed since regression, and he had already mastered this technique. Kim Young-hoon was happy, understanding that he had learned only one described technique. Would a warrior who reached the peak feel his presence? If he wished, he could kill anyone. And basically, So Eun-hyun was not surprised at all. He expected no less from such a talent. The director himself explained that he was thinking of traveling the world to gain combat experience, and suggested that the younger brother go with him. But the regressor refused. He made up a reason that he needed to stabilize his peak martial arts level. And basically, the older brother believed it. Considering that the wanderer was at an early stage, it sounded plausible. The warrior, meanwhile, was successfully learning to use the sword's vision. The hero explained that he was interested in a vacant position in the Imperial Palace. He promised that if he became an official, he would one day be able to help his younger brother. The swordsman decided to actively explore the world of martial arts, thus their paths diverged. But, of course, the protagonist's infiltration into the palace also had hidden motives. Being a strategist of the Alliance, the Wanderer found out that the Imperial family was more closely connected to the cultivators than any other faction. Rumors said that the ruling family was a branch of the Path clan of cultivators. Therefore, the regressor first joined the Imperial army, for recognition that he deserved in the world of martial arts, or willingly accepted into the army. And as soon as the warrior joined their ranks, he quickly advanced and reached the rank of general. Then he applied to the Imperial Guard and passed the selection without difficulty. All this took 5 years from the moment of regression. His boss reminded So Eun-hyun that his main task is to protect the emperor even at the cost of his own life. And, of course, since he was a spear warrior, it was more than feasible for him. The swordsman, however, swore to do everything possible to keep his word and fulfill his duty. In the end, the regressor was placed in the Imperial Shadow Guard, where he spent 4 months practicing stealth and concealment techniques until he was directly transferred to service. And finally the day came when he stood before the emperor. However, on that day the warrior made a shocking discovery. The emperor himself turned out to be a cultivator, so the wanderer did not see a single flaw in him. Then these doubts quickly vanished after the wanderer met several relatives of the emperor. Most of the imperial family had the same consciousness of a cultivator of the soul rank. His relatives were of low level. None of them could compare to Lis, but still they were cultivators of the chi purification level. So it was astonishing that a fighter of peak level was even needed. The emperor's consciousness was already undoubtedly broader than the first star of purification. And, considering this, he was stronger than any of the shadow guards. It turns out the guards were needed only so that he himself would not dirty his hands with the affairs of assassins. As is known, the emperor is the person most often targeted for assassination. They hunt him almost every night. The regressor's task is to deal with the malefactors. However, even such experience might be useful to him in the future. So the warrior took advantage of this opportunity. Thus, in service to the emperor as a fighter of the Shadow Guard, he spent another 5 years. Meanwhile, Kim Young-hoon became the leader of the Combat Alliance. Being a member of the Imperial Guard, the swordsman could not pay him an official visit, so they met secretly, got drunk to commemorate what was missed. And then the regressor saw his new level. The red line, as is known, indicates the most optimal trajectories for attacking the enemy. However, now, looking at Kim Young-hoon, the wanderer understood. If he got closer, any strike from the elder brother would inevitably reach him. This feeling was somewhat similar to the awareness of a cultivator. Of course, if the warrior had reached the stage of 3 flowers, he would see much more. But at least he could try to study the current state of the man more closely. Of course, the wanderer still did not understand much, but he believed that by observing him now, he would get a clue for the path of the sword. Soon, for not the first time, some transformations began to occur in the body of the elder brother, and he looked a little younger. The regressor congratulated him on his success. He had successfully reached the stage of 5 energies flowing to the source. However, Kim Young-hoon felt sorry for the younger brother. He was clearly unlucky. If he were at the level of 3 flowers, he could have comprehended much more. The swordsman himself understood this perfectly. He realized that he lacked the skills to achieve the level of 3 flowers. but he still took something useful for himself, so he would think about it after he returned home. After that, returning through the dark forest, the warrior pondered that, having somehow encountered cultivators, he noticed. The sphere surrounding Kim Yon-hoon looked more intense than that of a cultivator. In fact, the elder brother also believed that within his radius he could even fight a cultivator at the stage of purification. The level of 5 energies flowing to the source granted vision comparable to that of a cultivator. From these reflections, the regressor concluded, even martial arts masters, upon reaching the 5 energies, were capable of training like cultivators. Similar to the differences between peak warriors and first-class warriors, the level between the peak and the 5 energies differed by such a broad vision that it is hard to imagine. However, the wanderer was confident that one day today's experience would help him reach the 5 energies flowing to the source. After instructive teachings, the swordsman returned to the palace, and a few days later, during service, the wanderer met another assassin. Moreover, what surprised the main character was that this assassin was also at the peak level. However, her skills were quite raw, apparently because the fighter had only recently reached her level. When she lunged at the regressor, he easily accepted the fight. However, he could not shake off strange sensations. He had to focus on the duel, but his mind was filled with thoughts of Kim Yon-hoon, who had reached the level of 5 energies. It was very curious what sword energy really was. Perhaps it was proof that a person becomes one with the sword and comprehends the intermediate stage of a first-class warrior. Considering that after reaching the peak he gained the ability to see the optimal attack trajectory, sword energy never runs out as long as the sword follows the optimal path. And imagining the optimal path, that is the ideal finale one could wish for from his martial arts. Sword energy almost merged with one of his fencing styles, revealing the maximum potential. It turns out martial arts are equivalent to sword energy? This is what the warrior comprehended after so much training. But in truth, it could not be so. After all, if it were so, then a zombie trained in fencing, controlled by the cultivator, could also use the energy of the sword. It turns out, the energy of the sword is not just a martial art. In the end, the regressor began to develop a theory. Although the energy of the sword is created through training, at its core is the person themselves. It is born from the will of the warrior. And that means these red lines are far from just optimal attack trajectories. They are the volitional guides of the sword. They express its intention. Realizing this, the wanderer felt a strange sensation emanating from the hand gripping the sword, as if some veins had grown from the blade directly into his hand. Immediately after this, the swordsman lunged at the warrior woman and ended up breaking her blade with the force of his strike. Immediately after this, the mask flew off her face, and she herself was thrown far away from the Imperial chamber. The regressor understood that if he continued to direct his will through the sword, he would finally make a breakthrough. In the end, the warrior reached the vision of the sword, spending 10 years in the body of a peak warrior. Thus, he reached the middle stage of the peak of martial arts. At that time, the wanderer calmly approached the mercenary. She had a rather familiar face. The main character realized that she was one of the recently arrived servants of the Emperor. He was amazed that at such a young age she was a peak warrior. If she survived, she would easily reach the stage of 3 flowers. However, the regressor was struck by the fact that the woman recognized him and addressed him as the infinite martial monster. The swordsman remembered how 10 years ago he was known as the infinite warlike spirit, until one day the inhabitants began to call him the infinite warlike monster. The girl explained that her younger brother was much more gifted than she was, but he died because of the Emperor. However, the stranger did not care about her emotions. He still had to execute the assassin on the spot. Such were the conditions of service. At that moment, the other warriors gathered as soon as they heard about another assassination attempt. At the same time, the mercenary herself tried to explain to the infinite warlike monster that he was mistaken. People die by the will of the Emperor. However, the warrior cut off her head without regret. He understood that acting this way was right for him. Even a second's hesitation in killing was a crime. Afterwards, regretting that he had destroyed such a talent with his own hands, the regressor, together with his comrades, removed the body. The commotion was quite loud. However, the Emperor in his chambers did not even move. His chambers were sealed with a soundproofing spell. Since he did not hide that he was a cultivator, the Imperial Guard already knew who he was. Those who had reached the peak could see the cultivator's area of effect with the naked eye. But they guarded him obediently because that was their duty. And yet the traveler felt that recently there had been especially many assassination attempts. Under the Emperor's rule, the Empire flourished. There were poor people, but they either went peacefully or became bandits. So the swordsman was extremely curious to find out who was sending the assassins. And considering that the girl knew his name, it is not surprising that she was from this empire. In the end, the regressor decided to wait, understanding that time would reveal everything. In any case, he had already infiltrated the palace, so all that remained was for him to gather as much information as possible about the cultivators. Thus another 10 years passed, and thanks to honest service, the warrior gained the Emperor's trust. He used this power to gather information about his family. Of course, access to classified information was denied. But, piecing together the ruler's documents bit by bit, the Wanderer found clues about the cultivator's plans. Moreover, the regressor finally understood their approximate location. Honestly, it is practically impossible to obtain information about them, but even so, it is better than nothing. The swordsman was confident. Thanks to his work as an alliance strategist with combat experience gained almost every night, he might also reach the rank of 3 flowers in this life. After that, the Wanderer decided to undertake a census of the population. In the 33rd year according to the calendar, thanks to His Majesty, the number of orphans and poor people decreased. As a result, the likelihood of bandits appearing decreased. This report came straight from the meeting room. However, it was very raw. The most crucial points were clearly missing from this report. How exactly did they reduce the number of beggars? Perhaps they starved these people. But if the people were starving, the regressor would have known about it in previous regressions. It's not about social movements or help from the Imperial family. All these people simply disappeared quietly. And there was neither drought nor war. Then the warrior remembered the words of that mercenary from 10 years ago, that people perish by the Emperor's will. The swordsman understood that the Emperor was not a great sage, but a sufficiently competent ruler. Therefore, he was curious where the representatives of the poor strata of the population had gone, if even the council was unaware. Probably it was somehow connected with the clan of cultivators. All gaps in information are often related to them. But the Wanderer could not conduct a more detailed investigation, so he decided to entrust it to Kim Yeon-hun. At the same time, Kim Yeon-hun, the first leader of the combat alliance, resigned. Many were saddened by this fact, but he himself seemed only glad, and not without reason. His resignation meant that he, the master, had mastered all 6 books of the scripture on overcoming cultivation and exhausting martial arts. Now he set out to conquer the world of cultivators. When the regressor came to him, he noticed that the elder brother looked extremely inspired. And Kim Yeon-hun was momentarily frightened, because the aura of the Shadow Guardian radiated by the warrior increasingly resembled the aura of an assassin. In the end, the swordsman quickly told him all the information he had obtained in the palace. As expected, the mention of cultivators immediately enlivened Kim Yeon-hun. The Wanderer decided to name the places where they live, and asked him to go, check them, and gather as much information as possible. And of course the elder brother agreed. This topic was extremely interesting to him. Thus, through his elder brother, the regressor decided to investigate what the cultivators were plotting. Soon the warrior returned to the palace, and the guards came to report to the deputy captain about the work done. Moreover, the Wanderer noted that recently the number of assassination attempts had decreased. Perhaps the spear fighters were not infinite among the Emperor's enemies. However, suddenly the guard shouted, warning about assassins at the eastern gates. Soon after a fire broke out, a cultivator appeared. He realized that all the guards were of spear level. Clearly, he would have to deal with them. Because of their vision, he couldn't even properly use stealth techniques. Of course, So Eun-hyun was shocked that this time they entrusted the Emperor's assassination to a cultivator. The general immediately shouted, calling all the guard fighters to prepare for resistance. The cultivator understood how foolish this looked on their part. They hardly fought cultivators above the first star of the purification stage. And this cultivator, who came for the Emperor's soul, was a 2nd star cultivator. This literally meant the end for all of them. He would completely and utterly eliminate this vicious branch of the family. In the end, he threw out fiery amulets, and immediately human bodies began to catch fire like matches. The only one who managed to deflect this attack was the regressor, which greatly surprised the cultivator. However, he noticed that the insect had a somewhat too confident look. Therefore, he demanded that So Eun-hyun realize. After all, this was only his first attack to get rid of the annoying gnats. At this time, the soldiers outside had no idea what was happening inside, as there was some kind of barrier preventing them from breaking in. They suspected that perhaps some cultivator had attacked, so they summoned all the troops. At that very moment, the swordsman continued his fight. He tried to transform the sword energy, enhanced by chi, even if only for a second. The cultivator, pleased with himself, no longer knew how many times the warrior would have to repeat that his strength was not enough to break through his defensive techniques. However, when he struck the shield with all his might, it began to crack at the seams. In the end, the Wanderer managed to break through the defense and even scratch the cultivator's body a little. But unfortunately, all the enhanced energy he invested was wasted. After all, without a clear understanding, it is very difficult to maintain it for more than a second. At that moment, enraged, the cultivator lunged at the main hero. He began to trample him with his feet, not understanding how such a miserable insect dared to scratch him. Initially, he wanted to play with the regressor before killing him and getting rid of the Emperor. However, now the immortal decided to first stuff the warrior with pikes and tear him apart piece by piece until he died. Obviously, when everyone saw the cultivator's technique, they were already scared, not knowing how to help the vice captain. When they screamed, the immortal paid attention to them and instantly killed those 2 guys. He demanded that the miserable worms did not dare to interrupt him. They could get as heated as they wanted in front of the cultivator, but all they were destined for was to be crushed by his foot. The regressor really could not resist. He used too much energy at once, which turned his insides into a real mush. The cultivator began to break his arms to see how much this insolent man could endure. The warrior was obviously angry. However, he realized he was no better than an insect. His talent, skills, his whole life seemed to belong to the worm. The cultivator hoped that the stranger would now begin to beg for his life. However, the swordsman was not going to do anything like that. He understood that all this time dedicated to training and entire eras lived in battles were not in vain. The wanderer realized something. While the cultivator used stealth techniques, this guy hardly trained or fought at a distance. He was simply born talented. He was lucky to become a cultivator. And of course, the regressor could not fall before such a person. Lose to him? Moreover, the warrior was annoyed that someone claimed that everything he had experienced and all his efforts were in vain. There is no need to try to make him surrender, because even an insect will fight for life. The cultivator was furious when he saw this little man reaching out to him with his dirty paws. But at that moment he felt unwell, and blood poured from his nose. The poison with which the wanderer had smeared his sword took effect. Yes, the enhanced energy of the sword was needed to break through the cultivator's defensive techniques. Then it was the poison with which the regressor had coated the blade. Of course, the immortal quickly realized that he needed to neutralize this poison. However, the swordsman was not going to allow him to do that. He wanted the guy to finally understand. You should not look down on people like worms. After that, the warrior put his hand on his throat, thereby cutting off his ability to speak. Therefore, now he could not cast spells. Just like that, the wanderer blocked his right hand. He could not form seals. So now he was helpless and could do nothing. Gradually, as the man died, the barrier technique also began to fade. In the end, the soldiers broke inside. However, the battle was over, so they began evacuating the wounded, and the regressor looked one last time at his enemy, who so loudly called him a worm, although he forgot that before death all are equal. After losing consciousness, the main character finally woke up. However, next to him was a general, smoking tobacco as if nothing had happened. It turned out that he did not see a problem in this because he believed that tobacco was also a kind of medicinal herb. In the Middle Ages, a similar incorrect opinion was common. Also, the general explained that His Majesty the Emperor sent the Imperial doctor to treat the warrior. He must be grateful for the shown mercy. And indeed, the traveler's body seemed to become 100 times lighter. As expected from the Imperial healer, his skills were unmatched. The regressor almost envied the techniques he possessed. However, the general warned that the swordsman was seriously wounded. He would be able to use his right hand, but not as before. Probably it had not fully healed yet, so it was better not to strain it now. The warrior was not surprised by such a turn of events. This cultivator trampled heavily on his hand and even pierced it, so it definitely could not be healthy. However, the wanderer was grateful that he could at least use it. Moreover, it turned out that His Majesty was impressed by the main character's strength of spirit, and even awarded him a prize. As is known, official thanks from the Shadow Guard are not granted, so he asked that the general personally deliver this to the regressor. The Emperor ordered the vice-captain of the Imperial Shadow Guard, who protected the sacred throne selflessly, to take the pill of emptiness, made from the same materials as the cultivator's elixirs. After that, the wanderer finally took the box and began to recall what he had heard about this pill. The general reported that this was the very pill necessary for laying the foundations. They call it an essential preparation. However, he himself did not know what that meant. For So-un-hen, this explanation already made it clear that this pill was merely a byproduct of the foundation pills of qi. He had worked enough in pharmacy, making various potions, to understand that after purifying an elixir there would always be waste. Pills made from them are practically ineffective. Cultivators call them essential preparations, but this is known only to those closely related to alchemy. In essence, these are useless residues that are peddled as hangover remedies or supplements. The general had already explained that, according to rumors, if an ordinary person drinks this pill, it will extend their life by 10 years. Moreover, judging by the captain's look, he desired the pill, but did not dare to take away the Emperor's gift from the warrior. The regressor promised to take the preparation when his meridians recovered, and the general asked So-un-hen never to forget the boundless mercy of his emperor. The wanderer himself now realized that to experience the pill's effect, it was better to take it when his life began to wane. After all, there are perks to serving in the palace. If he eats this pill right before death, he can live another whole decade. Now finally his life played with new colors. After that, the swordsman continued his recovery and took up training. However, his body was in terrible pain. Of course it healed on its own, but every time he took up the sword he was pierced by incredible pain. And now the warrior could not use all 24 forms of the sword that cuts mountains. It seemed this was the limit of his combat abilities in this life, so Un-hyun was not going to give up. After all, the path to the peak of martial arts was also soaked with pain. Even if he had to endure some suffering, it didn't matter. Pain was a companion throughout his life. Therefore, the regressor would never give up and would continue to build strength at any cost. Another 10 years passed, and it was already the 30th year since the beginning of his last regression. Now he had mastered the vision of the sword. His combat techniques had strengthened, and stealth skills had become second nature. But most importantly, the Wanderer lifted the veil of Cultivator's secrets through letters from Kim Young-hoon. It turned out that the leaders of the Cultivators mostly hide their homes in powerful factions under divine protection. Weak cultivators build estates in the human world, but the geniuses of the clan live isolated within the clan's domains for greater safety. Ordinary people often live on cultivators' territories. They need servants, if not slaves. According to the latest report from the elder brother, those peak-level fighters who repeatedly tried to kill the Emperor were sent by cultivator clans that hire talented guys and train them. Now the warrior had a clearer picture. There is a high probability that the poor, who disappeared from the reports, simply ended up in the cultivator clans. And there they were, either raised as assassins or forced to serve the immortals. Considering that the last mercenary was the cultivator himself, the Emperor is probably somehow involved in the conflict between the clans. So the swordsman promised from now on to stop investigating this case and focus only on his martial arts. When he was thinking about it, his older brother Kim Young-hoon unexpectedly showed up as a guest, completely out of the blue. The regressor explained that he had just finished reading the letter his brother sent him. It turned out that he had sent it a month ago. Apparently, it was just delivered very late. But over the past month, Kim Young-hoon discovered something truly shocking, so he came personally. However, before saying anything, he decided to get rid of the suspicious spells cast on the younger brother's house. In the end, the elder brother revealed that there were two clans of cultivators in the kingdom. One is the current ruling family. The second is the previous ruling family, the Jin clan. For centuries, they have fought for control over the nation. But 100 years ago, the Imperial clan finally overthrew the predecessors who had long ruled the kingdom. Since then, the situation has remained unchanged. After the victory, the current emperor strengthened his influence. The Jin clan lost influence. Therefore, the latter began to agitate the common people and train masters of the spear martial arts to carry out assassination attempts on the emperor. And now, only the main question remains. How did the Jin clan manage to mass-produce so many spear masters that allowed them to send assassins of such caliber? The whole point is that they implant vengeful spirits from their own clan into the bodies of their assassins, which drain life force to the last drop, developing their talents to the limit. So Eun-hyun believed that representatives of the Jin clan kill members of the assassins' families and then stuff their souls into the fighters. However, it turned out that it was the current Imperial family that killed their relatives. The very clan that controlled the entire empire was engaged in mass murders. For the last several decades, they have been diligently capturing orphans, the poor, and also poor farmers to make pills. They extract the essence of blood and true inner chi from their bodies to make a forbidden elixir that extends the lifespan of cultivators. They kidnap those whom no one will look for to use them up, and from the dead bodies make their devilish pills. Obviously, So Eun-hyun was in complete shock, because this is literally cannibalism in its purest form. When Kim Young-hoon confirmed these words, the regressor simply froze. Cannibalism was not practiced by some savages, members of demonic cults, but by cultivators, the very ones who were granted the ability to cultivate to ascend to the heavens. In the end, nausea rose to the warrior's throat. He realized with disgust that cultivators resorted to cannibalism, and that he had dedicated his life to protecting these degenerates. So it happened that the Wanderer killed many people with his own hands. Also, Kim Young-hoon explained that while he was digging information about the current ruling family, representatives of the Jin clan contacted him and offered to join their fight against the clan of the current emperor. And he agreed, because these disgusting creatures who devour people did not deserve to live and even less deserve to rule this country. Throughout all the time, Kim Young-hoon fought many battles, created sects, gathered masters who shared the ideals. He proposed to So Eun-hyun to go with him. After all, if the throne returned to the Jin clan, it would be much better than now. The regressor was shocked, recalling the end of his second life. The real reason why cultivators of the core formation level stopped them then. He was bitter that he had wasted a whole life for this. In the end, the swordsman agreed. Kim Yeon-hun left the palace that day to join the forces opposing the Imperial cultivator family. They arrived at a mansion on the outskirts of the city. There gathered the most outstanding martial arts masters. Each of them was a personality of great fame and deadly skill. This was the Council of Elders, the 4 stars and the 3 demons. Even revered elders of the leading righteous schools of the entire kingdom were present. All of them were masters of the highest peak, capable of using the sword's vision, and more than 10 of them had reached the level of 3 flowers gathered at the summit. If it were not for the absence of several Murim masters, this force could even overturn the power of the Imperial house. Of course, everyone was disappointed in Kim Yon-hun, who dragged someone from the government, specifically from the Imperial Guard. After all, they could not trust this person, and the warrior understood. He had only one way to make these people trust him. In the end, the regressor began to pour out all the furious hatred accumulated in him towards the Emperor, releasing it in a stream of curses that struck absolutely everyone. He uttered such a poisonous abuse against the Emperor that the martial elites intervened to restrain the fighter, for they were already ready to believe him. And the Wanderer only got angrier. After all, he still had a lot to say about this vile ruler. In the end, when the swordsmen earned the trust of these people, they set out to destroy the cultivator's base. They met with other cultivators, and the warrior immediately noticed their uniform. This uniform was the same as that of the cultivator who came for the Emperor's soul. Kim Yon-hun approached the cultivators, reminded them that he had kept his promise, brought people who were on his side, so they wanted to help them destroy the current regime. After that, he asked his younger brother to follow him. They needed to make one more stop. The elder brother led the regressor to the cemetery where cultivators killed by the current Imperial family were buried. Kim Yon-hun found the remains so they could arrange graves for them. Of course, So Un-hyun was amazed that the elder brother personally buried so many people. Therefore, in the next moment, the young man himself began to recite the Heavenly Gate spell technique. The souls of the deceased turned into vengeful spirits because of their rage against the current Imperial family. That is why he learned the Heavenly Gate spell to give them peace. Soon after, they moved to the cultivators. One of them began to recite some kind of spell, and very soon the landscape around them changed. A disgusting smell of blood and rotting bodies appeared around, coming from afar. It turned out to be the palace of the current Imperial family. Moreover, their defensive formation was indeed very strong. However, upon hearing this, Kim Yon-hun, as if nothing had happened, stepped forward to deal with the problem. Of course, the cultivators asked why the elder allowed this mortal man to act without their permission. However, the immortal understood. Although Kim Yon-hun was mortal, he was different. After all, even now they were equal in power. At that moment, Kim Yon-hun himself began gathering energy in his hands, and his power was far beyond the 5 energies flowing to the source. In the end, with a single strike of a small energy cluster, he completely destroyed the barrier ahead. However, immediately after that, a huge number of zombies poured out from inside. Of course, the cultivator immediately ordered the fighters to start breaking through the dead straight to the castle. Thus the battle began, and very soon the henchmen of the current emperor realized they were facing the best martial arts masters. In the end, they ordered the 1st and 2nd star cultivators to retreat in order to call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, the regressor carefully observed the form of these people. He remembered the man because of whom he died in his past life. His form was exactly the same as those people from the current ruling clan. Moreover, the warrior was surprised that he saw red lines from the zombies. All this time, he thought it was the direction of the attack. However, it was astonishing. Where did the zombies get their own intention from? Perhaps it came from the one who controlled them. However, this is unlikely, because in that case, these zombies should have used internal energy. After that, the swordsman finally saw the cultivator who controlled them. Judging by the size of the formation, he was at least a 1-star stage purification cultivator. In the end, without much thought, the Wanderer immediately rushed at the distracted cultivator and struck him in the head with force. After that, he grabbed him, demanding an explanation of what was actually happening. He fearfully stated, looking at the bodies, that the first stage of purification was currently underway. They were extracting the life and innate energy of mortals to create the blood of origin. Then they delivered it to the superiors, who mixed all the blood in one place to begin the 2nd stage of purification. They repeated this process for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th stages. In the end, the pure blood, consisting of 1,000 mortal bloods and innate life energies, was used to make pills. Then it was transformed into the pill of rebirth, which was consumed by the elder of the core formation stage. If the regressor wanted, the cultivator would even give him the blood of the source. It itself already contained a huge amount of energy, so it could help So Un-hyun. However, the warrior simply wanted to learn all the production details in order to kill all these people without hesitation. However, unexpectedly, many armed shadow fighters appeared from the formation, led by a general, who attacked the main character as a traitor. The swordsman was clearly surprised to be called a traitor. He believed that perhaps the squad commander did not even suspect the atrocities the Imperial family was currently committing. However, he knew everything and, despite this, still swore loyalty to him. The whole reason was that they are the Emperor's hands and feet, who do not think for themselves but simply move according to his will. Of course, So Un-hyun was struck by the general's persistence. After all, in the eyes of the Emperor himself, they are no more than mere mortals, even worse than cattle. While they fought, the Wanderer also noticed that the general's skills had improved. Right now, he was approaching the sphere of the 3 flowers. However, unexpectedly, he decided to find out why the warrior suddenly thought that everything was different on his side. They were not so different. Ascetics considered all ordinary people insects. only the scale and methods differed. In the end, they would also exterminate the citizens of this empire for their own purposes. Therefore, the general understood. They could be even worse than those who rule now. While he was spinning his spear, the regressor realized that he was being drawn into a web of willpower energy. He could not stop this attack. However, in the silhouette of this man, the swordsman continued to see some strange light. A violet glow. Before attacking, the general explained, if neither side was better than the other, then he decided to stay with the one he had already chosen. Then So Eun-hyun finally understood. The commander was going to kill him with one strike. He could not help but appreciate such determination. He counterattacked using the sword that splits mountains, Echo of the Valley. This was the only technique the warrior currently possessed, and that could directly stop such strong energy. However, he could not control the power of this attack. As a result, the general's hand was cut off, and he himself was convinced that the stranger truly possessed skills more astonishing than any other. The general felt that the technique the regressor had just used was literally the enlightenment of the sphere of 3 flowers itself. Moreover, in his opinion, it was the most beautiful form he had ever seen in his entire life. The general aspired to combat enlightenment, dreaming of reaching the sphere of 3 flowers. But when he finally reached it, he realized it was merely the level of a worthless ascetic. The man understood that no martial art would ever surpass the sphere of those who cultivate the path. So all the martial arts to which he had devoted his life turned out to be nothing. In the end, he had only to continue searching for any meaning, any reason to justify his path. When the general began to lose consciousness, So Eun-hyun decided to find out why his men had not intervened in their battle. If the soldiers had intervened while the swordsman was fighting the general, perhaps So Eun-hyun would be lying dead now. However, they did not intervene, precisely at the request of the squad commander. He believed that if they intervened, the warrior would inevitably use poison or hidden weapons. And the general wanted to conduct a pure duel of martial mastery. The regressor was surprised. Explaining all this, the young people still called him the deputy commander of the Shadow Squad. In their ranks, if you had already become a commander, you were one forever. However, they also warned that if you once swore allegiance to His Majesty the Emperor, you could not break that oath. The warrior quickly realized that they were going to fight him for the current emperor. He was sincerely sorry. After all, he would have to kill these people today. At that moment, Kim Yong-hun led the advance forward, ordering the cultivators following him to destroy the ruling furnace of the Imperial family. Those who were weaker fought with swords. The cultivators hovered in the sky, fully engaged in reading spells, wielding elemental magic. The cultivators of the Imperial family could not wait for reinforcements. The mages of the collateral branch of the family. At that time, the wanderer was fighting with his former subordinates. However, they were clearly extremely dissatisfied that the warrior chose such a difficult path. Paralytic poison. He could have destroyed them all. If he had really done so, he would not have received a single wound. However, the regressor chose to take the damage himself and paralyze them. The swordsman reminded that the young man himself addressed him as the deputy commander, which means he could not just kill them. And to be honest, the young man was struck by such an answer, but quickly remembered that So Eun-hyun had always been a very interesting person. Losing consciousness, he decided to find out whether he had reached the level of 3 flowers. After all, although he did not see the red radiance around him, he saw how the strike suddenly broke through his defense. Unfortunately, So Eun-hyun had still not reached such a high level. He only gradually caught its outlines. The warrior saw the third color but could not see it constantly. Purple. Perhaps the wanderer needed one more life-and-death battle to see it again. At that moment, someone else appeared on the roof. The cultivator, to be honest, was amazed by the main hero's skill. Now he understood why the father had called him as reinforcement. So Eun-hyun was surprised when he saw the crown prince. Moreover, he did not understand why he just observed all the time and did not intervene. The reason was clear. He believed that this way the fight would stop being interesting. Besides, he asked the regressor not to call him the crown prince. Today he arrived as reinforcement, representing the Imperial clan. The swordsman was extremely displeased by the prince's talk of fun. After all, it seemed to him that he absolutely did not care that his own guards were dying. In the end, the young man had to explain a lot to the warrior, including the reason why he became the crown prince from a collateral branch. It turned out that at a young age he reached the 4th star of the chi purification stage. Just like his father. No matter how magnificent the enlightenment of the main hero's sword energy dawn was, he was at best at the level of the 1st or 3rd star of the purification stage. So it was unlikely that someone like So Eun-hyun could defeat him, having reached the 4th star. And of course, the wanderer did not doubt the prince's strength. He understood. Even a master of the 3 flowers level would have to risk his life to fight this monster. And he barely reached the edge of 3 flowers. The regressor understood that he would most likely die if he fought the prince. But a smile still appeared on his lips. The whole point was that the warrior was not afraid to die. If in order to grasp this enlightenment one must die, there was no difference in that. This is exactly what Kim Young-hun taught him when he fought against 50 warriors at the stage of energy formation. In his past life, the swordsman never managed to understand this teaching. But now it seems he finally began to understand. The prince was amazed when he saw that the stranger rushed at him, even knowing he would die. He thought that the reason for the protagonist's behavior was stupidity. But at that moment, the warrior recalled the record of the ascension to heavenly martial mastery. Chronicles of Overcoming Cultivation and the Limit of Martial Arts. In the end, with the help of his technique, he opened a breach in space and dissolved into it. In fact, the regressor memorized this technique entirely, although he did not understand a single line. He could perform it but could not comprehend it. But now, when the wanderer saw the violet path, he felt that he understood what the record of overcoming cultivation and exhausting martial arts was about. There was a phrase, "Martial arts exchange is a clash of colors." But is it possible to attack the color itself? The line that the warrior could not understand until he beheld the shine of 3 flowers gathered at the top. But now he understood. The very idea of color and the meaning of the attack on color went far beyond a simple exchange of techniques. This meant to sever the enemy's very perception so that the intention reached the depths. Previously, Kim Yon-hun could disappear like a ghost because he disrupted his perception, not allowing himself to be recognized. This is a martial art that allows masters to be on par with cultivators, a martial art created to surpass the heavens themselves. In the end, the swordsman attacked closely. At that moment, his body lost its camouflage. The heir, of course, immediately decided to find out what trick the stranger had just used. The warrior himself did not expect that a protective formation would appear around this boy's body. In the end, the heir, without much thought, immediately used his powers to throw him away. He perfectly understood that the main character's tricks were very amusing, but they were worthless against a true cultivator. In the end, he created a real storm that rushed at the regressor with incredible speed, so he urgently needed to dodge. While the warrior was running from the attack, he wondered, should he try again to approach the heir using the record of cultivation ascension? Although this tactic was dangerous, considering how many streams of wind were around the boy. If the stranger got too close, he would be torn to pieces. And even if he somehow managed to reach the prince, he would still have to break through his protective formation. However, the swordsman could easily dodge all his attacks, staying within the limits of his perception. But the martial arts master was no match compared to the spiritual power of the cultivator. No matter how much strength the regressor had, he would run out of breath before the cultivator got tired. The warrior was running out of time. He needed to finish this fight quickly. And for that, he needed to reach the state of 3 flowers gathered at the top right now. And when the wanderer stopped, the cultivator was very surprised, thinking that he had probably run out of breath. He also tried to attack him, but the regressor gripped the sword tighter and, preparing himself, met the strike face to face. In the end, he used the rising vein technique and managed to break the hurricane rushing at him. After performing such a technique, his hand holding the sword hurt like hell. But he needed to defend, not dodge. For this reason, despite the pain, the warrior overcame it and continued to strike without stopping. He didn't even care if his body turned into a rag or real minced meat. Meanwhile, the cultivator, with the furious power of his anger, created a real huge sand monster. Watching its approach, So Eun-hyun realized he could neither block nor dodge this strike. His instincts told him he would instantly die as soon as the attack hit him. But that didn't bother him. The swordsman simply decided to mindlessly chase the flicker of the purple thread, although he didn't even know what the purple light meant. As is known, blue is the will of protection, so it came from the wanderer. Red is the will to attack, so it came from the enemy. Perhaps purple is defense, attack, hatred, intentions acquired as a unified whole. The regressor always believed that red was the enemy's field. But from the opponent's point of view, his intentions are red, and the enemy's intentions are blue. It was all just a matter of perspective. Maybe they were all the same color. Martial arts cannot be completed alone. They need to be combined with the opponent's intentions. And the 3 flowers gathered at the top represent the kingdom where he could see himself reflected in the opponent. Now the warrior was about to reflect his art in the prince's perception and understand how much chi he wasted. He immediately grabbed a stronger sword, applying the sword vision technique. Previously, the wanderer could not hold it for more than a couple of seconds, even though he poured all his energy into it. And the reason was that his art was performed not only by the strength of the person himself. The perception of the opponent and the perception of the world truly completed the martial art. At this time, the guards, paralyzed, watched this fight. They all knew the outcome of the battle, that all of So Eun-hyun's resistance was pointless. He was fighting against a cultivator, a being with whom a martial arts master cannot compare. But at that moment, the guards could not believe their own. He mastered the power of the 3 flowers gathered at the summit. Now all his scattered energy began to return to him. Obviously, the prince panicked, not understanding what changes had occurred in the opponent. and the regressor asked His Highness to finally compose himself and not look so lost. The prince immediately, panicking, began to create a new formation to show the opponent how insignificant he was. He gathered many sand dragons, which were directed against the enemy. However, the warrior no longer felt any threat of death from these attacks. Now the wanderer understood. When he reached the state of the 3 flowers gathered at the summit, the technique surpassing mountains, the Lord of Mountains had to become the only move. In the end, he rushed forward, soared into the sky, and immediately pounced on them like a real panther. Right after that, the regressor disappeared right before the prince's eyes. However, the latter, panicking, reminded the enemy that he would not be able to break through his vortex. However, the swordsman understood that this was not so. Although it was a strong defense using the 9th technique, landscape painted by the blade, he could reflect this wind. Last time, the warrior could not break through this defensive formation that surrounded the prince's body. However, now he was sure that with his new power, everything would be different. And he turned out to be right. The enemy's head was practically severed. He, barely holding the bloodied neck, demanded that the enemy not come closer. He tried to escape by any means. However, So Eun-hyun could not allow him to do that. In the end, the wanderer caught up with him and first cut off the boy's legs so that he could no longer fly. The cultivator screamed, not understanding how it was possible for a fighter, an ordinary martial arts master, to defeat him. He demanded that the regressor not come closer, because then his actions would be no different from those of the Imperial family. Moreover, he tried to persuade the warrior that the Jin family, which he supported, had also reached the foundation stage using pills. Besides, the wanderer himself had received a pill from his father several years ago. That meant he was no different from them. However, to all these accusations, the swordsman simply showed a blood-red pill in his hands. He asked the prince not to worry about anything, because So Eun-hyun would never accept something made from cultivators. After that, the regressor intended to behead the boy. However, someone beheaded him faster. The warrior realized this only when he saw his body from bottom to top, and he clearly understood. The one who beheaded him was a cultivator of the purification stage. Such a feat was also within the power of a foundation-level cultivator, or Kim Young-hoon, who surpassed the stage of 5 energies flowing to the source. In the last moment, the wanderer only saw flashes of life before his eyes, in all the reincarnations he had seen until then. At this time, Kim Young-hoon was celebrating the fact that he had finally managed to kill a cultivator at the foundation-laying stage. Now martial arts masters could defeat cultivators. The regressor was already recalling how he had taught this person, how much he had done. He had just reached the power he had so long strived for. He did not want to die this time. The young man himself was breathing fearfully, looking at the amulet that had protected him. He said it was an amulet, and immediately its ability to strike the enemy with foundation-level power. In the end, he was happy. Apparently, he had managed to defeat this mortal after all. And the warrior was indignant. Why do cultivators always win? The swordsman remembered how his brother in his second life was able to defeat one cultivator, and he was the greatest martial arts master. Meanwhile, there were as many cultivators as stars in the night sky. It was literally an insurmountable wall, something beyond the hero's strength. He was on the verge of giving up. This tension made him want to abandon martial arts and return to selling soap. Kim Young-hoon was different. He always saw things through to the end. Then the wanderer prayed that he would not sacrifice himself, that he would not do this for his protection. However, the older brother understood. The younger always did everything he could, and now he had to repay him. For this reason, even when the regressor lost his mind, his body, driven by obsession, beheaded this young man. In the end, Seo Eun-hyun dedicated his entire life to martial arts, bled and endured suffering, and his hand held the sword until it shattered into pieces. The martial art he honed all his life continued. He continued to move his body even after death to complete his mission. The prince was overwhelmed by incredible fear, right up to his very death. And when Seo Eun-hyun's head finally fell to the ground, he was still smiling. Such was the hero's 5th reincarnation.